Welcome to Sleepy Time Story. Hey, my dear friends, if you're settled in, lights turned low, with tonight feeling just a little heavy or restless, I'm truly glad you found your way here.
Pull that blanket a bit closer because tonight we're heading somewhere no textbook ever quite captured the way it deserves. We're stepping into royal courts, the most dazzling, the most powerful, the most ruthless places that ever existed. And we're going to discuss their darkest, quietest, most whispered secret. Picture the most magnificent dinner table you've ever seen. Hundreds of candles, gold plates, the finest wine poured into crystal. The king himself sits at the head, surrounded by dukes, countesses, cardinals, princes, the most powerful humans alive. And somewhere at that table tonight, someone is going to die. Not by sword, not in battle, not from anything you'd ever see coming. They'll die from something with no smell, no color, no taste, something that looks exactly like salt or sugar or flour and fits perfectly in a human palm. Now here's what I want you to really feel for a moment. For most of recorded history, if someone slipped this into your food or wine, there was absolutely not nothing anyone could do to prove it happened. No test, no science, no way to look at a dead body and say with certainty, yes, this person was murdered. The killer would simply attend the funeral, say the right things, cry a few graceful tears, and then quietly collect whatever they came for. For centuries, the most powerful people in the world lived in genuine bone-deep terror of their own dinner table. And the ones who should have been most terrified, kings, queens, emperors, popes, were almost always the ones in the most danger. Tonight, we'll find out why. We'll move through some of the most dazzling and deadly courts in human history. From Renaissance Italy to the gilded halls of Versailles, from the Forbidden City in China to the harems of the Ottoman Empire. We'll meet the poisoners, the victims, the women who wielded this weapon when no other weapon was allowed, and the kings who covered up the truth because the truth was simply too dangerous to let live. And I promise you, the real stories are wilder, stranger, and more human than anything you've seen in a movie or read in a novel. But before we disappear into history together, if you're enjoying what I bring to this little corner of the night, and you haven't already, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you hit subscribe and tapped like on this video. Not because some algorithm told me to ask, but because it keeps this channel going, keeps the candles burning, and keeps the stories coming. And if this is your first time here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I always love knowing where in the world people are finding these stories. Now turn the lights down as low as they'll go. Maybe put on a fan or something soft in the background. And let's begin. Now, to understand why poison became the weapon of royal courts, you first have to understand something about power. Real power, the kind that comes with a crown. When you are a king or queen or emperor, you sit at the absolute top of a very tall, very unstable pyramid. And every single person below you, every minister, every duke, every cousin, every advisor, has something to gain if you disappear. In a world where one death could shift a throne, change a dynasty, redirect entire rivers of wealth, the temptation to reach for a shortcut was almost unbearable. But here's the problem with
H being powerful. You're also very visible. You can't exactly send a duke tumbling down a flight of stairs without raising eyebrows. You can't strangle a cardinal in broad daylight and expect to keep your seat at the table. The higher you are, the more scrutinized every death becomes. This is where poison enters the picture.
Specifically, this is where arsenic enters the picture. Now I want you to really understand what arsenic is and why it became the single most popular murder weapon in recorded history. Arsenic in its most common form, white arsenic, technically called arsenic trioxide, is a fine, odorless, colorless powder. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. It is nearly tasteless. Some people describe a very faint, slightly metallic quality, like the ghost of a flavor. But dissolved in wine or broth or a sweet dessert, absolutely nothing would alert you. Nothing on your tongue, nothing in your nose, nothing until your body began to shut down. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning: nausea, vomiting, severe stomach cramps, diarrhea, which sounds terrible, yes, but here's the diabolical part. Those are also the exact symptoms of cholera, of severe food poison, of half a dozen other common, completely ordinary illnesses of the medieval and early modern world. In an era before germ theory, before microscopes, before any kind of laboratory analysis, a doctor looking at a victim of arsenic poisoning would almost certainly write down died of natural causes, stomach ailment, bad constitution, the will of God, and the killer would already be home sleeping soundly. There is a reason historians have called arsenic the king of poisons. Not because it was the most dramatic or theatrical, but because it was the most perfect. It did the job quietly. It left almost no trace that anyone could identify. and it could be administered slowly over weeks or months in tiny doses that looked exactly like a long illness rather than murder. An Italian pharmacist writing in the 1500s described it with chilling admiration as the ideal companion of the impatient heir. And there's a reason the French, who would know given what was happening in their royal court in the 1600s, which we'll get to very soon, called it powder de succession, inheritance powder. You wanted what someone else had. You simply needed to be patient and have a steady hand. Now here is what makes this whole world even more fascinating and honestly a little terrifying. Arsenic wasn't some underground black market substance. This wasn't like smuggling a rare jungle plant from the tropics. Arsenic was everywhere. In the 15th and 1600s and well into the 1800s, white arsenic was sold openly in apothecary shops, the equivalent of your local pharmacy, for just a few pennies. You could buy it for rat control, for pest removal, for improving the complexion if you believed certain beauty guides of the era. Even for medicinal purposes, small doses of arsenic appeared in remedies for skin conditions and fevers. The result was that anyone who wanted it could get it: a kitchen servant, a jealous courtier, a disgruntled wife, a patient son watching his inheritance disappear in an old man's gambling debts. And this is where something deeply human comes into the story. Because we often imagine poisoners as calculating masterminds, cold, sophisticated, utterly without remorse. The dramatic villain stirring something sinister into a goblet with a knowing smile. The reality, as historians have uncovered it, is much more uncomfortable. Most of the people who turned to poison in the county, artisans and households of the past, were people who felt trapped. Women with no legal rights who had no way to escape a cruel or dangerous situation. Younger siblings with no inheritance and no future. Courtiers who had been passed over, humiliated, and could see no other way forward. The poison didn't just provide a way to kill. It provided something far more psychologically potent. It provided agency. In a world where most people, and especially most women, had almost no control over their own lives, the possession of a small paper packet of white powder was one of the only moments of real, raw power available to them. The historian Anne Somerset, writing about the great poison scandals of the French court, put it this way: in a world where violence was supposed to be the exclusive privilege of men with swords and armies, poison was something else entirely. It crossed every line of rank and gender and expectation. A kitchen girl could reach the king. A wife could reach a husband who outweighed her by 100 pounds and had the full force of the law on his side. And a clever cardinal could remove a pope. This is why courts became so obsessed with poison, not just as a practical threat, but as a philosophical one. It destabilized the entire pyramid. It made power feel fragile. And they were right to be afraid. Because for most of history, the really terrifying truth was this: if you were poisoned at dinner tonight, there was no test, no science, and no doctor alive who could prove it. That changed eventually. In 1832, a young English chemist named James Marsh was called to testify in a murder trial. A man named John Boddle had allegedly poisoned his elderly grandfather's coffee with arsenic to inherit his estate. Marsh managed to detect the arsenic using the best available method at the time. But by the time the evidence was presented to the jury, the chemical sample had degraded. The yellow precipitate crumbled, turned unreliable, and the jury couldn't be convinced. John Boddle walked free, and then, with absolutely magnificent timing, he confessed to the crime later anyway. James Marsh was furious. He spent the next several years developing something better, a method that could detect as little as 1/50th of a milligram of arsenic in human tissue, a test involving zinc, acid, and a small glass apparatus that would produce a distinctive, unmistakable silver, Y-black deposit. What became known as the arsenic mirror, if the poison was present. The Marsh test, first published in 1836, changed everything. For the first time in human history, the dead could testify. For the first time, a killer who had been counting on that comfortable silence, that centuries-old certainty that no one would ever know, had reason to be afraid of what science might find. The age of arsenic, as the perfect undetectable weapon, was over. But by that point, centuries of damage had already been done. And the courts where that damage happened, oh, those courts were something else entirely. You see, before we get to what poison did to individual people, to the victims, the families, the careers that were ended, we need to understand the environment that made all of this possible. We need to understand what life inside a royal court actually felt like. Because the courts of the Renaissance, of 17th century France, of the Ottoman and Chinese empires, they were not simply places where powerful people made decisions. They were pressure cookers. They were ecosystems of ambition and fear and performance, where the wrong word at dinner could end your career, the wrong alliance could end your freedom, and the wrong enemy could end your life. Every courtier woke up every morning knowing they were in competition with everyone around them. The king's smile, the queen's favor, the prime minister's ear. These were finite resources, and there were always more people hungry for them than there was room at the table. Add to that the very real fact that in most historical courts, the monarch's death meant an immediate reshuffling of every single power relationship in the kingdom. New king, new favorites, new queen, new maids-in-waiting, new minister, new alliances, fortunes made and destroyed overnight. In that world, that brittle, glittering, beautiful, terrifying world, is it any wonder that someone looked at the tiny white powder in their hand and thought, "This is the only way"? Tonight, we're going to meet the most extraordinary figures from this history. We're going to start with the most famous family of poisoners in the entire historical record, a family so notorious that their name became quite literally a verb in several languages. We're going to Italy of the 14th and 1500s. We're going to the Borgias. And I want to warn you now, the dinner invitation why? You're about to receive it as one you almost certainly do not want to accept, because everyone who sat at the Borgia table knew the risk, and some of them sat down anyway. That says something extraordinary about human ambition, and it's exactly where we're headed next. The Borgias. Just saying that name out loud feels like a warning, doesn't it? 5 centuries have passed since they walked the marble halls of Renaissance Rome, and still the name alone carries a kind of charge, a shiver of recognition. The way you feel when someone mentions a particularly dangerous neighborhood, even one you've never visited, that reaction, that instinctive unease is completely earned. And it's also, in a very interesting way, at least partly manufactured. Because one of the most fascinating things about the Borgia story, and I mean this as a genuine historical puzzle, not just a fun twist, is that we genuinely cannot be sure how much of their legend is real and how much was deliberately built by their enemies to destroy them. And in an era without newspapers, without fact-checking, without any way to trace the source of a rumor, a well-placed story could be just as lethal as a well-placed poison. Start at the beginning, because the Borgia rise to power is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the Catholic Church.
The family was originally Spanish, from Jativa near Valencia. They arrived in Italy as relative outsiders, which in the deeply territorial world of Renaissance Italian politics already made them targets.
In 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus was sailing across the Atlantic, which gives you a sense of the era, a man named Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. And here's the thing you need to understand about the papacy in the late 1500s. It was not simply a spiritual office. The Pope was one of the most powerful political rulers in all of Europe. He controlled land, armies, finances, and the eternal destiny of every Catholic soul on the continent. When a new Pope was elected, it was like the installation of a new emperor. So how did Rodrigo Borgia get there? Historians are fairly confident he bought the election. Not subtly either. Contemporary accounts describe a flow of silver, mules, offices, and promises so brazen that even other cardinals, not exactly a group known for their delicate sensibilities, were shocked. One cardinal who lost. The vote was reported to have said bitterly that Alexander had sold his soul to the devil. It was, depending on your sense of humor, either a very good deal or a very bad investment. Once in power, Alexander VI made absolutely no pretense of being a conventional pope. He had 4 known illegitimate children. He openly lived with his mistress, a famously beautiful young woman named Vanazza dei Catanei. He appointed his own son, Cesare, as a cardinal at the age of 18. He channeled the church's wealth directly into his family's political ambitions. And this is where the poison stories begin, because Alexander needed money, a great deal of it, and continuously. Cesare's military campaigns across Italy were expensive. Maintaining the loyalty of mercenary armies was expensive. Running a court of this scale was expensive, so Alexander looked around at who, in his immediate orbit, had accumulated the most wealth. The answer was his cardinals. Here's where church law becomes diabolically convenient. When a cardinal died without a clear will or designated heir, a significant portion of his estate, his properties, his gold, his offices, reverted to the Vatican, to the Pope. And Alexander VI, sitting atop that particular arrangement, appears to have looked at it and thought, well, the historical record, painstakingly assembled by scholars, including the researchers who published in the South African Journal of Medieval and Renaissance Studies, documents at least 5 cardinals whose deaths benefited the Borgia family in extraordinary ways. Cardinal Michiel died in 1503. His estate was valued at over 100,000 ducats, a sum so staggering that it would buy entire city districts. It went immediately to Alexander. Cardinal Dediena died suddenly in 1502 without a will. The Borgias confiscated everything. His own secretary was later found to have received what historians politely call a gratuity from Alexander. And when the next pope came to power, he stripped the secretary of that payment, essentially confirming everyone's suspicions about what the payment was for. Cardinal Orsini, old, nearly blind, politically inconvenient, was arrested on a trivial pretext and died in prison. The doctors diagnosed natural causes. The Pope gave him an excellent funeral. The Pope also kept his entire fortune. There was a grim rhythm to it. And then came the poison itself, or at least the legend of it. The Borgias are credited with using a substance called cantarella, which contemporaries described as a white powder, with a pleasant taste that could be mixed into wine or food. Scholars today believe cantarella was most likely an arsenic compound, possibly combined with other organic substances to delay or accelerate its effects. The researchers Caponari and Andrautsos, writing in Toxicology Research and Application in 2018, noted that the Borgias were said to have stored their rare poisons with the same care and discernment that they devoted to their finest vintage wines, which is honestly one of the most disturbing sentences I've ever read in an academic journal. The delivery methods were equally creative. Poisons reportedly hidden in drinks, yes, but also in gloves, in the pages of books, in flowers, in the letters sent to enemies. One contemporary source describes an assassination attempt against Alexander himself, involving poisoned letters concealed inside a reed flute sent by a musician from Florence. The musician was caught. He died under torture.
The Pope, apparently unbothered, went on with his day.
Now I want to pause here, because this is the moment where the story gets genuinely complicated. There's a very important question that historians have been wrestling with for 5 centuries, and it deserves a real, honest answer. How much of this is actually true? The scholars Retief and Cilliers, who conducted probably the most rigorous modern analysis of Borgia-era poisoning, concluded that the Borgias' reputation as poisoners has been significantly overstated. Not invented, but inflated.
Here's why that matters.
Renaissance Italy was a world drowning in political propaganda. Pamphlets, rumors, and whispered accusations were weapons as real as any blade. The Borgias had powerful enemies: the Sforza family, the Orsini family, the French, various Italian city-states who resented their growing power. And one of the most effective ways to destroy a family's reputation in that era was to attach the word poison to their name, because once that word was spoken, every subsequent death in your orbit became evidence. Every illness became suspicious.
Every inheritance became sinister. The Borgias were real criminals in real ways. The corruption, the nepotism, the violence, Cesare's brutality, which was well documented by contemporaries. But the supernatural level of their poisoning reputation may owe something to a very effective assassination campaign being run against them by people who had every reason to make them look as monstrous as possible. And nobody suffered more from this particular machinery than one specific member of the family, Lucrezia Borgia. Now be honest with me for a moment. When you heard that name, what image came to mind? Beautiful, yes. Dangerous, probably. Some kind of ring with a hidden compartment. Poison in the wine. Bodies left in her wake like petals falling from a particularly lethal flower. That image has been refined and polished and handed down through operas, novels, films, and television for 500 years. Gaetano Donizetti wrote an opera about her in 1833 that cemented her legend as a femme fatale in the cultural imagination of the entire Western world. And the historical record says there is essentially no credible evidence that Lucrezia Borgia poisoned anyone, not one verified victim, not one documented case. What the historical record actually shows is a young woman who was married off the first time at the age of 13 to Giovanni Sforza to cement a political alliance. When that alliance was no longer useful, her father and brother had the marriage annulled on the grounds that Giovanni was impotent. Giovanni Sforza, furious and humiliated, retaliated the only way he could. He started spreading rumors of incest between Lucrezia and her father and Lucrezia and her brother. Those rumors spread. They attached themselves to her name like burrs on wool. Every unexplained death in the vicinity of the Borgias, and there were many because powerful families in Renaissance Italy accumulated enemies, and those enemies had a habit of dying, was added to Lucrezia's account. And she had absolutely no way to defend herself because the legal, social, and political structures of her world gave her no mechanism for defense. Modern historian Sarah Bradford, whose biography of Lucrezia is considered one of the most authoritative, concluded that Lucrezia was essentially a pawn, used repeatedly as political leverage by her father and brother, married and remarried as diplomatic currency, and then condemned by history for the sins of the men who controlled her.
What we actually know about Lucrezia's later life tells a very different story than the opera villain after the death. Eaths of her father and the collapse of Gevere's power in 1503 and 1507 respectively, Lucrezia settled in Ferrara as duchess. And there, far from Rome, something remarkable happened. She became known as an extraordinarily capable administrator. She ran the duchy as regent during her husband's military campaigns. She was a passionate patron of the arts, gathering poets and scholars around her. The poet Ludovico Ariosto praised her beauty and honesty in Orlando Furioso, one of the most celebrated literary works of the Renaissance. When Ferrara came under threat from Pope Julius II in 1510, Lucrezia pawned her own jewels to help pay for the city's defense. She died in 1519 at the age of 39 from complications following childbirth. In Ferrara, she was mourned as La Buona Duchessa, the good duchess. That name didn't make it into the opera. So where does that leave us with the Borgias as a whole? Here, I think, is the honest answer. Pope Alexander VI almost certainly used poison, or ordered it used, to eliminate at least some of the cardinals whose wealth he wanted. The financial pattern is too consistent, too convenient, too well documented to be coincidence. The specific poison call. Ed Cantarella was probably real, probably arsenic-based, and probably far less exotic than the legend suggests. Cesare Borgia was brutal, yes, murderous, absolutely. But his preferred tools were military force, political manipulation, and, occasionally, strangling, not subtle poisoning. He was, if anything, too blunt for that kind of patience. Lucrezia was almost certainly innocent of everything she was accused of, and one of the most egregiously slandered women in the history of Western civilization. And here is the darkest irony of the entire Borgia story, the one that I think deserves to sit with you for a moment before we move on. In August 1503, Alexander VI and Cesare were both invited to dine at the vineyard estate of a cardinal named Adriano Castellasi. Shortly after the dinner, both of them fell violently ill with fever and vomiting. Cesare eventually recovered.
Alexander did not. He died on the 18th of August, 1503.
Gossips immediately and gleefully spread the story that the Borgias had accidentally drunk their own poison, that a servant had mixed up the cups, delivering the fatal dose to the wrong people. It was, if true, the kind of cosmic justice that even the most cynical
Michael observer would have to admire.
But the historians say it was almost certainly malaria. 1503 was a bad year for it in Rome. The timing, the symptoms, the seasonal pattern, it all fits. The poison story was better, though, and in the world of Renaissance reputation management, better always beat true. It is a lesson that the royal courts of the world would go on proving over and over again in the centuries that followed. Speaking of which, if you think the Borgias were the peak of aristocratic poison culture, I need to tell you about what was happening roughly 150 years later in the most glamorous palace in the world, Versailles of Louis XIV. Because if Renaissance Italy was the birthplace of poison as a political weapon, France in the 1600s was where it became something much stranger, much more widespread, and much more frightening, touching not just a few cardinals, but reaching all the way to the king's own bedroom. The story that's coming next involves black masses performed in candlelit chapels, a network of poisoners that stretched across the entire city of Paris, a woman who built a criminal empire out of other people's desperation, and a king powerful enough to bury the
truth forever.
There is a room in the Château de Blois in the Loire Valley of France that has been making tourists uncomfortable for several hundred years. It sits quietly off one of the grand corridors, paneled in dark wood, looking at first glance perfectly unremarkable. And then your guide points to the walls. Hidden in the woodwork, carved so precisely that you almost miss them until they're pointed out, are 237 small cabinets, each one with its own tiny door. Each one, the legend says, built to hold a different poison. People stand in that room and feel something cold move through them even today, even knowing what they know about history and exaggeration and the tendency of stories to grow in the telling. Because the woman those cabinets belong to, the woman who allegedly filled them, is one of the most fascinating, most debated, and most misunderstood figures in the entire history of European power. Her name was Catherine de' Medici, and before I tell you about those cabinets, I need to tell you something that most people don't know, something that completely changes how the rest of the story feels. For 26 years, Catherine de' Medici had absolutely no power at all. Think about that number, 26 years. That is longer than many people's entire careers, longer than some marriages. And for Catherine, a woman born into one of the wealthiest, most politically formidable families in all of Italy, a woman who'd been educated alongside future cardinals and diplomats, a woman of fierce intelligence and extraordinary patience. Those 26 years were spent watching someone else run her life, her court, and her husband. That someone else was a woman named Diane de Poitiers. And if you want to understand Catherine de' Medici, really understand her, not just the legend but the person, you have to start with Diane. Catherine was born in Florence in 1519, into the heart of the Medici dynasty. Her uncle was Pope Clement VII.
Her family had bankrolled the Renaissance.
She arrived in France in 1533 at the age of 14 to marry Henry, the Duke of Orleans, who would eventually become King Henry II of France. They were both 14 years old at the wedding, which even by the standards of the 16th century was considered young. Now here is the detail that sets the entire trajectory of Catherine's life. Henry already had a mistress.
Her name was Diane de Poitiers, and she was 19 years old, even then.
19 years older than Catherine, too, which meant she was 33 when this 14-year-old girl arrived from Florence to become her rival. And Diane did not feel threatened, not even slightly. The imperial ambassador at the French court left a record, vivid, almost painfully specific, of what he witnessed during Catherine's early years as queen. He described King Henry sitting on Diane de Poitiers' lap in front of assembled guests, playing the guitar, discussing matters of state, and running his hands over her in ways that left nothing to the imagination. Diane, the ambassador noted, received all of this as simply her due. Catherine, meanwhile, was reported to have watched from across the room. Henry gave Diane the Chateau de Chenonceau, the jewel of the Loire Valley, the castle that Catherine had specifically wanted for herself, as a gift. He gave her titles, revenues, influence over court appointments, and most devastatingly, oversight of the education of Catherine's own children. For 26 years, Catherine endured this. She smiled. She was gracious. She produced 10 children, 7 of whom survived infancy. She made herself useful, made herself quiet, and made herself wait. Then, on a warm summer afternoon in June of 1559, everything changed in an instant. Henry II decided to participate in a jousting tournament to celebrate a royal wedding. It was the kind of thing kings did. Dangerous, yes, but also deeply expected. A show of strength and martial virtue. His final opponent was a young captain named Gabriel de Montgomery. They rode against each other. Montgomery's lance shattered. Splinters of wood drove directly through the visor of the king's helmet and into his eye, and from there into his brain. Contemporary accounts say that Catherine, Diane de Poitiers, and the young crown prince all fainted simultaneously when it happened. Henry II lingered for 10 days. Catherine sat by his bedside for every one of them. Diane de Poitiers, as one chronicler recorded, stayed away entirely for fear of being expelled by the Queen. She understood even before Henry died that the world had just turned on its axis. When Henry finally died on the 10th of July 1559, Catherine de' Medici moved with a speed and decisiveness that stunned the entire court. She denied Diane de Poitiers access to the king's deathbed. She stripped her of her jewels, the crown jewels that Henry had lavished on her over decades. She took back the Chateau de Chenonceau. She banished Diane from court permanently and kept her exiled to a smaller property until Diane's death 7 years later. And in a letter she wrote to one of her children years later, describing how she had felt all those years watching her husband with his mistress, Catherine chose precisely 4 words that historians have quoted ever since. She wrote, "Never has a woman who loved her husband liked his whore." 26 years of silence, and then 4 words. Now she had 3 sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, who would each in turn become King of France. All 3 of them, for different reasons, needed managing. Francis died at 16 after only 17 months on the throne. Charles was 10 years old when he inherited the crown. Henry III was brilliant but unstable, consumed by religious devotion and court theatrics. What this meant in practical terms was that Catherine de' Medici, for the better part of 30 years, was the person actually holding France together. And this is where the poison legend truly takes root. Because a woman with that much power in that era needed an explanation, and the explanation that her enemies settled on was poison. Let me tell you about the cabinets. The room at Château de Blois with its 237 hidden compartments is real. Catherine's connection to that room is real. The legend of what those cabinets held has been passed down for centuries and is, according to Atlas Obscura and most serious historians, almost certainly not true. Historians today believe the cabinets most likely held confidential papers, small art objects, or personal correspondence. The kind of private documents that a woman wielding enormous informal power in a court full of rivals absolutely needed to keep hidden from prying eyes. As Atlas Obscura's researchers put it with admirable honesty, this conclusion is a little bit disappointing. But here is the thing that I find genuinely fascinating about the cabinet legend. It tells us something true, even if the contents were false. Because the legend exists because Catherine had power, and because the people threatened by that power needed to explain it in a way that made it seem illegitimate, monstrous even. And in 16th century France, for a woman, particularly an Italian woman, in a country that deeply distrusted Italians, the most monstrous explanation available was poison. By the 1570s, there were reportedly around 30,000 sorcerers, alchemists, and poison traders operating in Paris. 30,000 in a city where the population was perhaps 300,000 total. Poison was everywhere. Rumors of it were everywhere. And Catherine, the Italian queen mother who consulted astrologers and kept mysterious cabinets and had a habit of outliving her enemies, became the natural center of every rumor in the city. But here is the question I want you to think about for a moment. What did Catherine actually use for power, if not poison? The answer is deeply interesting, and it had nothing to do with anything you could store in a cabinet. Catherine de' Medici understood with absolute clarity that in a world where women were excluded from formal political structures, information was the most valuable weapon available, and she built a machine to collect it. The Flying Squadron, as it was called in French, the Escadron Volant, was Catherine's network of approximately 80 beautiful, educated, strategically deployed women who served as ladies-in-waiting, social entertainers, and, as contemporaries gleefully reported, sources of very particular kinds of intelligence. These women were placed in the orbits of powerful men at court. They attended dinners, they danced, they cultivated relationships, and they reported back. Historians debate the exact nature and extent of the Flying Squadron. Some argue it was less formalized than the legend suggests. But what is not debated is that Catherine maintained an extraordinary network of informants, that she had an almost supernatural ability to know what was being said and planned at her court, and that she used this knowledge with devastating political effectiveness. It was information as power, relationships as leverage, intimacy as intelligence gathering, which, when you think about it, is far more sophisticated than anything you could keep in a cabinet. Now, I promised you the full truth about Catherine, and the full truth is complicated, because she was not innocent. Not even close. The question of poison, specifically, the evidence is thin. The most famous accusation involves a woman named Jeanne d'Albret, the Protestant Queen of Navarre, who died in Paris on the 9th of June 1572, 6 weeks before the wedding of her son Henry to Catherine's daughter Margaret. Huguenot writers immediately Ely accused Catherine of sending Jeanne a gift of perfumed gloves treated with poison. The perfumed glove story is beautifully, almost unbearably perfect, because Catherine had been the person who introduced perfumed Italian gloves into French fashion in the first place, making them a court staple. The accusation essentially said she weaponized her own gift to French culture. Modern scholars examining the historical record believe Jeanne most likely died of tuberculosis. The symptoms, the timeline, the context, it fits a natural death far better than poisoning. But what happened 6 weeks after Jeanne's death is not in dispute. And it is far worse than any poisoned glove. On the night of August the 23rd, 1572, just 4 days after the wedding of Margaret and Henry of Navarre, which had brought thousands of Protestant Huguenots into the heart of Catholic Paris, the killing began. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre started, as historians have painstakingly reconstructed, from a chaotic chain of decisions made over approximately 48 hours in an atmosphere of panic, mutual suspicion, and religious hatred that had been building for decades, an attempted assassination of the Protestant militia. Ittery leader Admiral Coligny on August 22nd. He was shot from a window but only wounded, triggered a spiral of fear and recrimination at court. Catherine, convinced that the Huguenots would retaliate for the failed assassination and that her son's throne was in danger, appears to have been the central force pushing for what happened next. What happened next was the systematic murder of Protestant leaders throughout Paris, which then exploded into days of mob violence across the entire city and eventually spread to provinces across France. Historians estimate between 5,000 and 30,000 Protestants were killed. 5,000 at the very lowest count, 30,000 at the highest. This was not poison. This was not a quiet, deniable, untraceable death in the night. This was the most catastrophic act of violence committed by the French crown in the entire 16th century, and Catherine de' Medici was at the center of it. Her son Charles IX, who was mentally fragile and who swung between boasting about the death toll and collapsing in guilt over it, eventually told his mother, "You are the cause of it all." He died 2 years later at the age of 23, some contemporaries believed broken by what he had witnessed. Historian Mary Hollingsworth, in her recent biography of Catherine, describes her as remarkably maligned, meaning that her reputation has been damaged and distorted far beyond what the historical record actually justifies. The poison, specifically the witchcraft, specifically the cabinets full of arsenic, specifically, these are almost certainly inventions or gross exaggerations rooted in misogyny and political propaganda. But the massacre, the 30 years of ruthless political maneuvering, the willingness to make impossible decisions in the name of keeping the crown on her family's heads, that part is real. And Catherine would not, I think, have wanted you to pretend otherwise. She died at Chateau de Blois on the 5th of January 1589, at the age of 69. Her physician diagnosed pleurisy. She had spent her final months trying to hold together a France that was tearing itself apart, undermined now by her own son, Henry III, who had dismissed her ministers without warning and effectively ended her formal role in government. A chronicler who recorded her death left behind one of the most startlingly brutal assessments in the historical record. He wrote that the moment she was gone, she was treated, and I want to get this phrasing exactly right because it is extraordinary, with about as much consideration as a dead goat. 69 years old. Decades of holding France together. 3 sons on the throne. 10 children carried, 7 raised, several buried. And they treated her like livestock. There is something in that detail that feels worth sitting with for a moment. She fled in her final years to Blois specifically because her astrologer had told her she would die near Saint-Germain, near the church of Saint-Germain in Paris, which she could see from her bedroom window at the Louvre. She was so haunted by that prophecy that she relocated entirely just to put distance between herself and a building. And when the young priest came to administer her last rites at Blois, she asked his name. He told her Julian de Saint-Germain. Whether that story is exactly true or has been embellished over the centuries, it is one of the most perfectly constructed endings in all of early modern history. The woman who spent her entire life maneuvering around prophecy, meeting her fate in the one place she thought she was safe from it, named in her final moments by the very thing she tried to escape. Now, here is something I want you to hold on to as we move into what comes next. The Borgias used poison to steal from dead cardinals. Catherine de' Medici may or may not have used poison at all, but the legend of the female poisoner, the dangerous, manipulative, morally corrupt woman who operates through stealth rather than honest force, was now fully established in the European imagination, and France was about to provide it with its most spectacular case. Not a queen, not a woman born into dynasty and privilege, but a marquise, a well-born, charming, utterly unassuming aristocrat who decided with remarkable clarity and cold precision that the problem with her life was easily solved, and that the solution came in a small white powder that you could buy in Paris in the 1660s for almost nothing at all. Her name was Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, and the story she left behind made everything we have discussed so far look almost restrained. Picture the most unlikely murderer you can imagine, not a shadowy figure in a dark alley. Not a desperate man with nothing left to lose. Not a scheming general with an army at his back. Instead, picture a woman described by every contemporary who met her as pretty, delicate, even with what one chronicler specifically called an endearing air of childlike innocence. Well-dressed, well-educated, fluent in Latin, from one of the most respectable families in all of Paris. The kind of woman who spent her afternoons doing charity work at the hospital, bringing food and comfort to the sick and the dying. That woman was Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, and the food she was bringing to those hospital patients was poisoned every single time. I want to tell you her story carefully, because it is not just the story of one woman's crimes. It is the story of how a single trial, a single execution in a Paris public square on a July afternoon in 1676, cracked open a scandal so enormous, so far-reaching, so deeply embedded in the highest levels of French society that the most powerful king in Europe would spend the next 6 years desperately trying to contain it and failing. But let's begin at the beginning, because the Marquise de Brinvilliers did not start as a murderer. She started as a daughter. Marie-Madeleine was born in 1630 in Paris, the eldest child of Antoine d'Aubray, who held one of the most powerful administrative positions in the city. Civil lieutenant of Paris, essentially the chief law enforcement officer of the capital. The family was wealthy, noble, and at least publicly entirely respectable. She was educated well for a girl of her class and era. She could read and write, not a given even among noble women at the time. And she had the refined manners expected of someone who would eventually be married into another prominent family. In 1651, at the age of 21, she married Antoine Gobelin, who took the title Marquis de Brinvilliers. Her dowry was 200,000 livres. His estate was valued at 800,000 livres. On paper, it looked like precisely the right kind of life. In practice, her husband was an inveterate gambler who was steadily spending his way through both their fortunes, and then fled France entirely to escape his creditors. And somewhere in that unraveling, the Marquis introduced his wife to a friend of his, a cavalry captain named Gaudin de Sainte-Croix, a man who was charming, reckless, passionate about alchemy, and deeply, catastrophically bad for her. The affair was open and scandalous. Marie Madeleine made no attempt to hide. She spent money she did not have on Sainte Croix, lavishing him with gifts while her own finances crumbled. Her father, Antoine d'Aubray, the civil lieutenant of Paris, remember, a man with real power in this city, was appalled, embarrassed, and then decisive. In 1663, he obtained what was called a lettre de cachet, a royal arrest order, signed by the king himself, which could imprison anyone without trial. He used it against Sainte Croix. The captain was arrested in the street, directly in front of the Marquise, thrown into a carriage, and delivered to the Bastille prison. He was held there for approximately a year. And here is where history takes one of its darkest turns. Because in the Bastille in the early 1660s, there was another prisoner, an Italian chemist named Egidio Exili, who'd been placed there not for any specific crime, but because King Louis XIV was suspicious of his presence in France and found imprisonment a tidy solution. Exili was in the service of Queen Christina of Sweden and was, according to everyone who encountered him, extraordinarily knowledgeable about poison. Sainte Croix and Exili shared a cell. They had approximately a year together. When Sainte Croix was released, he established a small alchemy business, which gave him a legal reason to maintain a laboratory and work with chemicals, and resumed his relationship with the Marquise, and taught her everything he had learned. Now I want to ask you something. Put yourself, just for a moment, in Marie Madeleine's position. Your father used his power to have your lover arrested and imprisoned without trial. You have watched your husband gamble away your security. Your inheritance, the money that belongs to your family, is controlled by men, by your father, and by your brothers who will inherit after him. You will receive only what they choose to give you. There is no legal mechanism for you to earn your own income. There is no court you can appeal to. There is no authority you can invoke. What would you do?
I'm not justifying the answer she found. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What the Marquise de Brinvilliers did was monstrous. The scale of her experimentation alone would qualify as crimes against humanity in any modern framework. But I think it matters to understand that she was operating inside a system that had stripped her of every legitimate option, and what she
I chose instead was to become, with extraordinary methodical precision, a scientist of death. She needed to test her poisons before she used them on her family. She needed to understand dosages. How much was needed to kill a large person versus a frail one? How quickly different compounds worked, what symptoms they produced, whether they could be detected. And she had access, as a noble woman performing charity work, to the Hôtel Dieu Hospital in Paris, one of the largest hospitals in the city, full of poor and already sick patients who would receive charity visitors without question. According to the Lieutenant General of Police Gabriel Nicolas Della Reynie, who investigated her case in exhaustive detail, the Marquise arrived at the Hôtel Dieu regularly, bringing food, bringing wine, offering kindness, and the food and the wine were laced with varying concentrations of her poisons. She would observe the patients, note what happened, adjust her formulas, and return. The estimated number of hospital victims ranges, depending on the source, from around 30 to somewhere near 50. Many were already dying, and their deaths went unremarked. Some may have recovered.
The precise number will
never be known because at the time no one was asking questions about why sick, poor people were dying in a charity hospital. That is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with, I think. Not the murders of her family, which are terrible, but those anonymous deaths in that hospital ward. People who came to a place of healing and instead encountered a noble woman conducting experiments on them. When she was satisfied that her formulas worked, she turned them toward her actual targets. Her father, Antoine d'Aubray, died on the 10th of September 1666. He had been ill for months. In her later confession, the Marquise admitted to slipping poison into his food approximately 30 times, small doses repeated, designed to produce a slow decline that would look like natural illness. She was present at his estate during the final weeks, playing the devoted daughter, personally preparing food and medicine for her dying father. The autopsy concluded he had died of natural causes complicated by gout. She inherited part of his estate, but sharing it with her two brothers, Antoine and Francois, did not make her as wealthy as she needed to be. So in 1670, she arranged for a young man she employed, D. nicknamed La Chaussee, to enter the household of her brother Antoine as a servant. La Chaussee's real job was to continue her work.
Antoine d'Aubray died. Francois d'Aubray followed him weeks later. Both deaths were attributed to natural causes. Both autopsies performed at the time with the limited tools of 17th century medicine found nothing suspicious.
Later examinations conducted after the investigation began would find traces of arsenic in the exhumed remains. But by then the Marquise was already gone, because the entire architecture of her plan had been built on a single assumption:
that St. Croix would survive her,
that her lover, her accomplice, her teacher would outlive all of this and keep silent. In 1672, St. Croix died suddenly in his apartment.
The cause was almost certainly accidental.
He had continued experimenting with toxic substances in a home laboratory, and most likely inhaled something fatal during one of his experiments. He left no will, and because he died in debt, his possessions were immediately impounded by magistrates pending review by his creditors. Among those possessions was a locked box marked in St. Croix's own handwriting with the following
NG instruction:
to be opened in the event of my death prior to that of Madame de Brinvilliers. He meant it as a dead man's protection, a guarantee that the Marquise would be motivated to keep him alive, because only his death would open the box and expose everything. It was a love letter written in threat. It was also, in retrospect, one of the most spectacularly miscalculated pieces of blackmail in history, because St. Croix died exactly when he had stipulated he would not. The magistrates opened the box. Inside, they found St. Croix's detailed diary of their entire operation. They found love letters from the Marquise. They found 2 signed promissory notes from her, dated within days of her brother's deaths, promising St. Croix his share of the inheritance. And they found a collection of small glass vials, each carefully labeled, not with a name, but with a clinical description of its specific effects on the human body. The Marquise, learning that the box had been opened, fled Paris immediately. She went to England, then to the Netherlands, then to a convent near Liege, in what is now Belgium, where she may have hoped to disappear quietly into a life of religious retreat. She'd been gone for 4 years when a French police officer named François Desgrais arrived at the convent in 1676. He was dressed as a priest. He asked to speak with her. She came out.
He arrested her.
When she was brought back to Paris and her belongings were searched, investigators found a handwritten document she had been carrying. She had titled it, in her own hand, My Confessions. It described, in the Marquise's own words, the poisoning of her father, her brothers, and several others. It also described failed attempts to poison her husband, her daughter, and her sister.
She tried to recant it all at trial. She insisted the document had been written in a moment of private despair and was never meant to be read.
She blamed everything on St. Croix.
She performed, by all accounts, a masterclass in aristocratic composure under questioning, neither fully denying nor fully admitting, dancing around the edges of evidence with what one observer called infuriating calm. When the court finally ordered torture, the infamous water cure in which the prisoner was forcibly held down and made to consume enormous quantities of water until the body and the mind both broke, the Marquise drank 16 pints and then confessed to everything. On the morning of the 17th of July, 1676, she was brought barefoot to the doors of Notre Dame Cathedral in a rough white shift, a lighted torch in her hand, and there she recited her formal acknowledgement of guilt on her knees before the assembled crowd. She was then loaded onto a cart and driven through the streets of Paris to the Place de Grève, the public execution ground on the banks of the Seine, where the executioner beheaded her with a sword. Her body was thrown onto a pyre and burned. Her ashes were scattered into the river. The crowd that came to watch was enormous. Paris had not been so riveted in years. A woman named Madame de Sévigné, one of the most celebrated letter writers of the 17th century, whose correspondence has become a primary historical source for the era, was present in that crowd. And afterward she wrote to her daughter, with the particular chilling elegance that made her famous, that the ashes of the Marquise were now in the air, scattered on the wind, and that therefore all of Paris would breathe them in. And through breathing them in, she warned, all of Paris might in time develop a poisoning urge that would astonish everyone. Madame de Sévigné intended this, I think, as a piece of dark wit, a clever line. She did not realize as she wrote it that she was writing prophecy, because what the Marquise's trial had done was not just reveal one woman's crimes. It had revealed a possibility. It had made the city of Paris, and the court of the Sun King himself, look around and ask a question that, once asked, could not be unasked. If she was doing this, who else was? When they began to investigate that question, beginning in 1677 under the direction of La Reynie,
the Lieutenant General of Police. They found an answer that shook the most powerful monarchy in Europe to its foundations. The network they uncovered was not a handful of desperate criminals operating in shadows. It was a citywide web of alchemists, fortune-tellers, midwives, and poisoners serving clients who ranged from struggling minor aristocrats all the way up, uncomfortably, impossibly far up, into the innermost circles of Versailles itself. And at the center of that web was a woman, a Paris-based diviner and sorceress named Catherine de Chaise, the woman everyone knew simply as La Voisin. Her story makes the Marquise de Brinvilliers look in retrospect almost simple. What does it actually take to build an empire in a city like Paris in the 1660s? Capital, obviously, connections, a product that people genuinely need, or at least desperately believe they need, and a very clear understanding of what your customers are afraid of, what they want, and what they will pay almost anything to get. Catherine de Chaise had all of these things. She was not born into them. She grew up poor, learned palmistry as a child. She would later say she began reading fortunes at the age of 9. She married a silk merchant named Antoine Montfaucon, who turned out to be spectacularly bad at running a business. When his shop failed and the debt collectors came calling, Catherine faced a choice that women of her era faced constantly: return to poverty or find another way. She found another way. She opened a practice as a fortune teller, then as a face reader and palm reader, then as an herbalist, then as a midwife. And here is where her business began to diverge from what her competitors were offering. Because as a midwife serving clients in a city where Catholicism forbade birth control and where an unwanted pregnancy could destroy a woman's reputation, La Voisin offered one service that other midwives officially could not: abortion. It was illegal.
It was dangerous. It was exactly what hundreds of women in Paris needed. And she built a referral network for it, subcontracting to other providers, taking a percentage of every fee.
Expanding her client base steadily upward through the social hierarchy until the women sitting in her waiting room were not seamstresses and shopkeepers,
but countesses and duchesses, arriving in carriages, sending servants ahead to ensure privacy.
By the 1670s, La Voisin was living in a large house in the Villeneuve-de-Gravier neighborhood of Paris. She threw parties.
She wore diamonds. She kept a menagerie of exotic animals. She employed a personal astrologer, a network of associate fortune tellers, several alchemists, and at least one priest willing to perform ceremonies that no church would officially sanction. She was, by any reasonable definition, a businesswoman operating at the top of her market. Now here is the thing you need to understand about the world La Voisin was serving, because it makes everything that follows make sense. The court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most absolute monarch in Europe, the man who ruled France from the Palace of Versailles like a minor deity, was built on a single axis of power. Everything revolved around the king. His favor could make a family wealthy for generations. His displeasure could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. And for the noble women who surrounded him, there was exactly one reliable path to influence: the king's bed. Louis XIV fathered 15 known illegitimate children with his official mistresses alone. This number, historians remind us, does not count the considerable number of women with whom he was less formally involved. Professor Lynn Mollenauer of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, who specializes in this period, has described the competition for royal attention as legion, a word that captures something important about both the scale and the desperation of what was happening. Think about what that competition looked like from inside it. You are a noble woman at Versailles. Your husband's fortune, your children's future, your own social survival depend on maintaining access to a man who is famously inconstant, easily bored, constantly surrounded by beautiful and ambitious women, and whose attention can vanish between one morning and the next. There is no legal mechanism for you to secure your position. There's no financial instrument, no contract, no court of appeal. There is only the king's mood. What do? Some women managed it through charm and intelligence alone, others through political alliances, and some, a remarkable number as it turned out, made their way to a house in Paris where a woman in diamonds would read your palm, assess your situation, and offer
you a range of services designed to solve exactly the kinds of problems that Versailles created. Love potions were the gateway product. The ingredients were genuinely horrible. Iron filings, the powdered bones of various animals, herbs that may or may not have had pharmacological effects, and substances I will leave to your imagination because this is a bedtime story, and I want you to actually sleep. But the potions were popular, and they were apparently considered effective by the women who used them. Effective in this context meant one specific thing: the king kept coming back. And the most important, most powerful, most influential client that La Voisin ever acquired first came to her in 1667. Her name was Françoise Athéna de Roquechouateau, Marquise de Montespan, and she was, for approximately 13 years, the official principal mistress of Louis XIV. Let's talk about Madame de Montespan for a moment, because she is one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire 17th century, and she deserves more than a footnote. She was brilliant, absolutely devastatingly brilliant, witty in a court that prized wit above almost everything, beautiful in a court that prized beauty, political, shrewd in a court where politics was a full-contact sport. She bore the king's 7 children, and she managed, through an extended period of serious competition, to remain his chief mistress for over a decade. She was, by the standards of her world, spectacularly successful. She was also, according to the testimony that would eventually emerge from La Voisin's interrogation, a regular customer. The relationship began, according to multiple accounts, around 1667, when Montespan was still trying to establish herself as the king's primary favorite and needed to displace her predecessor, Louise de la Vallière. She sent her companion, a former actress named Claude de Vinne, to visit La Voisin. She wanted love potions, something to secure the king's attention and hold it, whatever La Voisin provided, and historians debate the extent to which the potions had any real pharmacological effect versus a powerful placebo effect on Montespan herself, who believed in them absolutely. The relationship between the king and his new mistress deepened, and Montespan kept coming back. Over the course of the next decade, she reportedly purchased love potions that were somehow introduced into the king's favor. Odd and drink. She participated, according to testimony gathered during the investigation, in ritual ceremonies conducted by La Voisin and her associates. And at some point, and this is where the story crosses from the merely scandalous into the genuinely disturbing, the ceremonies appear to have escalated considerably in nature. The man at the center of the most disturbing testimony was a priest named Etienne Gueberg, elderly, thoroughly uninterested in the vows he had taken, and apparently quite willing to perform services that no ordained minister should ever have considered. Guibourg confessed in considerable detail to performing what were called black masses for La Voisin's clients. These were ceremonies that inverted the Catholic Mass performed in darkness, in service of petitions to forces that were decidedly not the God that Guibourg was supposedly ordained to serve. Guibourg himself, in his confession, described the rituals with a matter-of-fact specificity that investigators found deeply unsettling. He had, he acknowledged, performed 3 such masses for Madame de Montespan specifically. I want to be careful here about what we actually know versus what was claimed. Becker. This is exactly the kind of historical territory where torture, confession, and cross-examination produce testimony that mixes genuine events with what interrogators were hoping to hear, what historians consider reasonably well established.
Montespan was a client of La Voisin's. She purchased love potions over an extended period. There were ritual ceremonies involved. The general shape of the scandal, a network of fortune-tellers and alchemists serving the aristocracy of Versailles, is not seriously disputed. What historians consider more contested, the most extreme details of what those ceremonies involved, the precise nature of Montespan's personal participation, and above all, the question of whether there was a genuine plot to poison the king. Because La Voisin, when questioned, and here is a detail that historians note with a certain dark amusement, was reportedly questioned at one point while intoxicated. She was by this stage of her life a fairly serious drinker, and drunk, she spoke freely. She named Montespan as a customer. She described the nature of the services provided. She described the rituals. She claimed or appeared to claim that when the king began showing
interest in a young woman named Mademoiselle de Fontanger in 1679, Montespan had asked for more extreme measures, up to and including, allegedly, the king's assassination. Louis XIV, reading the transcripts of these interrogations, was placed in an impossible position. Here was the woman who had shared his bed for over a decade, borne his children, sat at his right hand at state dinners, advised him on matters of policy. Named in testimony obtained from his own police investigation as a client of a network of poisoners and black mass practitioners who may or may not have been trying to kill him. What do you do with that, if you are the Sun King? The answer, apparently, is you proceed very carefully. La Voisin was arrested on the 12th of March 1679, caught outside a church called Notre-Dame de Bonne Nouvelle, which, given the nature of her activities, has a certain irony to it. She was imprisoned at Vincennes, and she was eventually tried by the special tribunal that La Reynie had established specifically for this investigation, the Chamber Ardente, which translates appropriately as the Burning Court. La Voisin was burned at the stake on the 22nd of February 1680. Eyewitnesses record. That she went to her execution with a combination of resignation and defiance that impressed even those who had come specifically to watch her die. When the flames reached her, she reportedly pushed the torch away from herself, according to one account, and had to be restrained. She died without naming all of the names she could have named, because she knew, as the Marquise de Brinvilliers had moaned before her, that some names were simply too dangerous to say aloud. But the investigation did not end with her death. It continued. And 6 months after La Voisin burned at the Place de Grève, her daughter, Marguerite, imprisoned separately, began to talk. What Marguerite said landed on Lorraine's desk like a cannonball fired through the wall of the Palace of Versailles. She named Madame de Montespan. She described what she had personally witnessed. She placed the king's favorite mistress, the mother of 7 of his children, the woman still living at Versailles, still attending his dinners, at the center of a network of occult rituals going back more than a decade. Lorraine forwarded the testimony to the king. Louis XIV read it. Then he made a decision that tells you everything you need to know about how power actually works in every era and every country and every court that has ever existed. He did not charge Montespan. He did not exile her, not immediately. He quietly removed her from her closest position to him. He suspended the public proceedings of the Chamber Ardente when the names got too close to the throne. He ordered many of the documents relating to the Montespan testimony sealed or destroyed. The witnesses who could not be safely tried publicly, including Marguerite Montvoisin, including the priest Iberg, were imprisoned under lettre de cachet, which meant they had no legal existence, no right to trial, and no mechanism for anyone outside the prison walls to know they were there. They simply disappeared. The police chief, La Rainey, who had built this entire investigation with meticulous care and genuine courage, wrote in his private notes what he could not say publicly. He observed that the enormity of the crimes he was investigating had proven to be their own protection. The bigger the scandal, the more powerful the people involved, the less likely that justice would be fully served. He was right, and he knew it. The Chamber Ardente was officially dissolved in 1682. The official record showed 36 executions, 23 exiles, and numerous imprisonments. The unofficial record, the sealed documents, the disappeared witnesses, the testimony that never reached a courtroom, would not be fully examined by historians until centuries later. Madame de Montespan continued living at Versailles for some time after the investigation closed. The king still visited her, but the warmth between them, as she herself would write in her memoirs, was gone. He did not return, she wrote, to that sweet and agreeable intimacy which had united us for so many years. By 1681, she'd been replaced as the king's primary companion by a woman named Françoise d'Aubigné, the Marquise de Maintenon, the governess to the king's illegitimate children, described by those who knew her as deeply religious, morally rigorous, and absolutely no fun whatsoever. Louis XIV, the man who had once maintained a court so awash in intrigue, seduction, and occult practice that his own police chief could barely contain it, spent the last decades of his life in quiet domesticity with a pious widow. Professor Mollenauer, describing this transformation, offered the driest possibility. BLE academic assessment. The king, she said, closed the door to his bedroom, and in doing so, he closed the avenue of power that the affair of the poisons had run through. The golden age of court poison was over, or so it appeared. But the story of poison in the royal courts of the world was far from finished. Not in France, not in the Ottoman Empire, not in China. Because where there is a throne, there are people who want to sit on it. And where there are people who want to sit on a throne, there are other people willing to help them get there by any means available. Some of those means involved poisons that left no trace. Some involved rituals performed in secret. And some involved the most intimate possible access to power. The women and the men who slept beside the most powerful people in the world, and who sometimes decided that love, in the end, was simply not worth the competition. The next chapter in this story takes us somewhere very different from Paris. Somewhere the politics of succession were governed not by Versailles etiquette, but by a law so brutally simple, so nakedly honest about what power actually requires, that it makes the affair of the poisons look almost polite. We are going to the Ottoman Empire, where a sultan's mother held more power than almost anyone alive, where brothers were born into a system designed to ensure that most of them would not live long enough to threaten the one who took the throne, and where the harem, that word so romanticized by European imagination, was in reality one of the most sophisticated, most dangerous, and most politically consequential institutions in the entire history of organized power. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to certain rooms, not the silence of an empty library or a quiet garden, something heavier, the silence of a place where you've been left to wait, and where the waiting itself is the punishment. Somewhere inside the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, there were rooms where that silence lasted for decades. The windows were beautiful, stained glass inlaid with jewels, casting coloured light across the floors in blues and greens that shimmered like the surface of the Bosphorus just visible in the distance. The carpets were thick and soft. The food was brought regularly. There were servants and musicians on certain evenings, and the company of women who had been caught, chosen specifically because they could not give birth to heirs, and there was absolutely nowhere to go. This was the kafes, a word that means in Ottoman Turkish both cage and palanquin, both a prison and a vehicle of transport, both the place where you were kept and the thing that might eventually carry you forward, if you survived long enough, if the right sultan died at the right moment, if your name happened to come up before your mind finally broke under the weight of years of elegant, suffocating stillness. Before we can talk about what poison meant inside the Ottoman harem, we need to talk about what the Ottoman harem actually was. Because European imagination, fed by centuries of engravings showing beautiful women lounging on cushions, got almost everything wrong. The harem was not a pleasure house. It was a political institution, one of the most sophisticated, most dangerous, and most consequential political institutions in the history of the world. And to understand it, we have to start with the law. In the middle of the 15th century, a sultan named Mehmed II, the man history calls Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who took Constantinople in 1453 and made it the Ottoman See. Epitel sat down and wrote into his legal code something that no ruler before him had ever quite committed to paper so directly. He wrote, "Whichever of my sons inherits the Sultan's throne, it behooves him to kill his brothers in the interest of the world order." Let that settle for a moment. He did not say, "Try to avoid killing your brothers." He did not say, "Consider it as a last resort." He said, "Do it. For the good of the empire. For the sake of order, kill them." And he included in that sentence the most remarkable legal phrase in the history of succession politics. Most of the jurists have approved this procedure. This was the Ottoman law of fratricide, and it was not merely theoretical. Over the roughly 150 years that it was in active use, it resulted in the deaths of at least 80 members of the House of Osman. 80 princes, strangled usually, because the execution method for royalty required that no royal blood be shed. The instrument was a silk cord. The executioner, in a detail that feels almost satirical, was the Sultan's head gardener, a man whose official title was Bostan Sabasi, the chief of a corps of palace gardeners who also functioned as the Sultan's perso, now bodyguard and, when required, as his killers. Imagine that career description. The practical logic of fratricide was not irrational, even if its human cost was catastrophic. The Ottomans had watched other empires, the Seljuks, the Mongols, tear themselves apart in succession wars between rival brothers. They had decided that one terrible night of killing was preferable to years of civil war. One death that you planned versus thousands of deaths that you didn't. But the logic created its own extremes. The most extreme single act of fratricide in Ottoman history took place on a single night in 1595, when a sultan named Mehmed III ascended the throne. In order to secure his position, he had 19 of his brothers killed, all on the same night. Some of them were still infants. Some of them, according to contemporary accounts, were still at the breast. All of them were strangled with silk cords and buried the next morning with their father. 19 brothers one night. And Mehmed III was, by Ottoman legal standards, operating entirely within the law. That night appears to have been a turning point in public opinion. Something shifted. A collective sense that this particular policy had gone far.
Far enough.
And when Mehmed III died in 1603, his successor, a 13-year-old named Ahmed I, made a decision that would change the empire's structure for the next 3 centuries. Ahmed I did not kill his brother. His brother Mustafa was kept alive. He was placed in a suite of rooms inside the palace, the kafes, comfortable, well-attended, watched over constantly, and completely unable to leave or to accumulate any followers or resources. The kafes had begun. Now I want you to sit with what this actually meant for the people inside it, because the psychological reality of the kafes is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing chapters in the entire history of royal succession. Princes entered the kafes at puberty. They lived there under what the historian David Graeber described as solitary confinement, though it was never called that, and the rooms were certainly more comfortable than any prison. They were kept company by women who had been sterilized or were otherwise guaranteed not to produce heirs. Their chief permitted recreation, according to one historical source that manages to be both precise and heartbreaking, was macrama, knotting decorative cords in rooms. The jeweled windows overlooking one of the most powerful empires in the world, with no access to government, no military experience, no exposure to the outside world, and no certain date of release. Some princes spent 10 years in the caves, some spent 20. Some spent their entire lives there and died without ever ascending the throne. And some, the ones whose names ended up in the history books, emerged after decades of isolation to suddenly become the ruler of 40 million people. Can you imagine what that does to a person? The most documented case of what the caves could produce is a sultan named Ibrahim, who came to the throne in 1640 and is remembered by history as Ibrahim the Mad. Ibrahim had spent his entire childhood in the caves. He had watched his brothers, one by one, be removed from their rooms and executed as his older brother Murad IV consolidated his power. He had survived by complete accident. Murad died young in 1640, and Ibrahim was the only remaining member of the dynasty. They literally had to convince him to come out. According to accounts, when the palace officials came to tell him he was now the sultan, Ibrahim refused to open his door. He was convinced it was a trap.
He was right to be suspicious. His whole life had been a trap, just not the kind he was imagining in that moment. Ibrahim ruled for 8 years.
In those 8 years, he ordered his entire harem, 300 women by some accounts, 280 by others, sewn into weighted sacks and dropped into the Bosphorus. He did this, historians suggest, because a rumor reached him that one of them had been intimate with an outsider, and he could not determine which one. His solution was to eliminate all of them and start again. He was eventually removed from the throne by coup in 1648 and strangled. His 6-year-old son became sultan. That 6-year-old son's name was Mehmed IV. And this is where the story finally arrives at what I promised you at the end of the last part. The place where the harem was not merely a passive setting for power, but the active engine of it. Because a 6-year-old sultan needed a regent. And in the Ottoman system, the regent of a minor sultan was his mother, a woman who held the title Valid Sultan, Queen Mother. The position of Valid Sultan was the second most powerful position in the entire Ottoman Empire, below only the Sultan himself, above the Grand Vizier, above every general, every governor, every religious authority. If your son sat on the throne, you held an empire in your hands. In 1648, there were 2 women who both believed they should hold that position. One was Turhan Hattis Sultan, Mehmed IV's mother, a young woman captured in a Tatar raid on what is now Ukraine, who had entered the harem as a slave and risen to become the mother of the new sultan. The other was Kersem Sultan, and Kersem Sultan is the reason this part of the story exists. She was born Anastasia somewhere in the Greek islands, possibly on the island of Tinos around 1589. She was enslaved as a child and sent to the palace of the governor of Bosnia, then transferred to the imperial harem in Constantinople. She was given the name Mopika, meaning moon-faced, in Persian for her beauty, and sometime around 1603 or 1604, she caught the attention of Sultan Ahmed I. Ahmed gave her a new name. He called her Hesam, an old Turkish word meaning the ram that leads the flock. He appears to have understood what he was looking at. Kersem became Ahmed's Hasaki, his chief consort, and bore him 4 sons, Murad, Ibrahim, Qasim, and several others who did not survive childhood. When Ahmed died in 1617, he was only 27 years old. Kersam found herself in the most dangerous position imaginable, a widow in a palace full of competing factions, with sons whose lives depended entirely on her ability to navigate a succession crisis. She navigated it brilliantly. Over the next 3 decades, Kersem Sultan exercised political power in the Ottoman Empire across 3 different reigns. She attended government meetings from behind a screen, as convention required, but her voice carried through that screen clearly enough. She corresponded directly with foreign ambassadors. The Venetian ambassador Paolo Contarini had written in 1583, during an earlier period, that the Sultan based all his actions on his mother's advice. And this observation would have applied even more precisely to Kersam during the reigns of her sons Murad IV, her son Ibrahim, and her grandson Mehmed IV. She did not hesitate when hesitation would have been fatal. When her son Ibrahim became so dangerous to the empire, his behavior so erratic, his decisions so catastrophic, that the Janissaries and the religious authorities came to her seeking consent to remove him, Kersam gave that consent. Her own son, the man she had protected and raised and maneuvered onto the throne. She signed his death warrant because the alternative was worse. Ibrahim was strangled on the 18th of August, 1648. His 6-year-old son took the throne, and Kursum, who had now helped to place 3 sultans on the Ottoman throne, had every intention of ruling through this one as well. But Tarhan was not Kursum. Tarhan Hattis Sultan was young, barely 20, and had come to power with no preparation, no established networks, no decades of palace experience. On paper, she should have been completely outmaneuvered by a woman who had been playing this game since before Tarhan was born. On paper. What Kursum underestimated was how quickly Tarhan was learning. And what Tarhan understood, with the clarity that only genuine danger produces, was that Kursum Sultan's existence was incompatible with her own son's survival. Because Kursum in 1651 was reportedly planning to replace Mehmed IV on the throne with a different grandson, a child whose mother would be easier to control. She wanted to remove the very sultan she herself had installed. She wanted to start over with a more compliant arrangement. Turhan found out. On the night of the 2nd of September 1651, the 16th day of Ramadan, the chief black eunuch of the palace descended on Kursum's quarters with over 100 armed men. Kursum heard them coming and ran. She hid in a cabinet in her own room, pulling her robes in after her, but a corner of her dress protruded through the door, and a servant found it. She fought.
Every account agrees on this. She fought with extraordinary ferocity for a woman in her 60s. She strangled at least one attacker with her bare hands. She bit another hard enough that he stopped and pulled back. She nearly escaped through a secret passage that she had apparently known about for years.
But there were too many of them, and eventually a curtain cord, stripped from the drapes of her own rooms, was used to strangle her. She was buried the next morning in the mausoleum of Ahmed I, the man who had named her Kursum, the ram that leads the flock. The people of Istanbul mourned for 3 days without being asked to. Now step back from the drama of that night for a moment, because there is something larger here worth understanding. Every woman in this story, Hurrem Sultan, who broke every Ottoman tradition by convincing Suleiman, the Magnificent, to actually
marry her. Kursum, who exercised the power of a regent across 3 decades.
Tarhan, who ordered the assassination of the most powerful woman in the empire to protect her 6-year-old son. Every single one of them began as a slave, captured in raids, purchased at markets, sent to a palace where their value was initially measured entirely by their physical appearance and their ability to produce a male heir. And yet they accumulated within that system a kind of power that the male officials who surrounded them, the grand viziers, the generals, the janissary commanders, found repeatedly astonishing, threatening, and ultimately impossible to simply dismiss or destroy. The historian Leslie Pearce, who has written the definitive scholarly study of the Ottoman imperial harem, has described these women as operating in a system that simultaneously constrained them absolutely and offered them a path to extraordinary influence. They could not leave the palace. They could not appear publicly. They could not hold official titles. And yet they controlled armies, managed state finances, wrote letters to foreign kings, and occasionally, as Kursum Sultan demonstrated, arranged for the strangulation their own children in the interests of political stability. This is not the story that European painters had in mind when they depicted the harem as a place of languid, perfumed leisure. The poison in the Ottoman harem was not always literal. Sometimes it was a whispered accusation. Sometimes it was the withdrawal of influence. Sometimes it was the slow maneuvering of alliances, the careful removal of rivals through marriage or exile rather than through a cup of wine or a bowl of soup. But when it was literal, when the competition for the throne became sufficiently desperate, it was exactly as literal as anything we have seen in Paris or in Rome. And the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, the final heir of this entire extraordinary system, emerged from the cafes in 1918. He had been confined since childhood. He had spent 56 years in those rooms with the stained-glass blue windows. He had spent 56 years doing what, one wonders? The empire collapsed 4 years later. There is something quietly devastating about that. The story of poison in royal courts, it turns out, is not one story. It is many stories running in parallel across different continents and different centuries, shaped by different languages and different laws and different customs, but sharing a single underlying logic. Wherever power is concentrated, and wherever access to that power is restricted, people will find ways, creative, desperate, sometimes extraordinary ways, to reach toward it. We have seen that in France. We've seen it in the Ottoman Empire. And right at this moment, on the other side of the world from both of them, inside the walls of the most deliberately isolated palace complex ever built, the same drama was playing out in a language none of these European or Ottoman players would have recognized, in a court so secretive that its name literally meant forbidden. in a system so rigid that the very elixirs meant to make its emperors immortal were quietly killing them instead. We are going to the Forbidden City next, and the story there, of poison, of obsession, of power and its discontents, is unlike anything we've seen so far. Consider two deaths that happened in November of 1908 inside the walls of the most secretive palace complex ever built, 22 hours apart. The first, a 37-year-old man lying on an island within the palace grounds, screaming from stomach pain. His face had turned dark. His tongue, according to the physician who attended him, was scorched yellow. He'd been a prisoner in his own palace for 10 years. His name was Zaishan.
History calls him the Guangxu Emperor. And on the morning of the 14th of November 1908, the official imperial medical records recorded that he died of a sudden illness. The second, a 74-year-old woman lying in her own chambers across the palace grounds, who had been seriously ill for months. She died the following afternoon. Her name was Cixi. She was his aunt, and she had ruled China in one form or another, from behind screens and through proxies, and by sheer force of personality for 47 years, 22 hours apart. Now you tell me what you think happened. The palace where all of this occurred is known in English as the Forbidden City. In Chinese, its name is Zijincheng, the Purple Forbidden City, named after the color associated with the North Star, the pivot of heaven, the fixed point around which all celestial power rotates. The emperor was the son of heaven, and the place where he lived was designed to remind everyone within it and everyone outside of it of exactly that fact. It was built between 1406 and 1420 by more than 1 million workers. When they finally finished, it covered 72 hectares in the heart of Beijing. It had walls 10 meters high and a moat 52 meters wide. It contained, by the most careful modern count, 8,886 rooms. Though the legend designed to impress always said 9,999, because heaven had 10,000 rooms, and it would have been arrogant to match heaven exactly. At its height, the Forbidden City housed approximately 9,000 eunuchs, thousands of concubines, the imperial family, the imperial household staff, and 24 emperors over the course of 5 centuries. It was quite literally a city within a city, a world within a world. And almost everything that happened inside it was invisible to the outside. That invisibility was the point. The Forbidden City was built on a simple principle. The emperor is the axis of everything, and the emperor must be protected from foreign powers, from domestic conspirators, from rivals, and from the truth when the truth becomes inconvenient. Everything that moved through those walls moved through layers of intermediaries. Eunuchs who carried messages, concubines who managed information, officials who framed reports in the most acceptable possible terms before the why reached the imperial ear. In a system like that, sealed, hierarchical, where access to the emperor was the only meaningful currency, the same dynamic we saw in Versailles, the same dynamic we saw in Topkapi Palace, emerges with remarkable consistency. The people who controlled access to power were not always the people who appeared to hold it. And in the Forbidden City of the late 19th century, the person who actually held it was a woman who had entered the palace at 16 as a low-ranking concubine, ranked 5th of 9 grades, and had spent the next 5 decades turning that starting position into something no one around her had anticipated. Her Manchu name was Ye Nara. She came to the palace in 1851. She bore the Xianfeng Emperor, his only surviving son, in 1856, which elevated her from obscurity to something considerably more significant. When the Xianfeng Emperor died in 1861, his son was 5 years old, and Cixi, for that was the honorific name she took, meaning kindly and joyous, moved immediately and decisively to ensure that the regency would belong to her. She launched a coup within weeks of her husband's death. She outmaneuvered 8 appointed regents. She formed an alliance. NCE with the senior Empress Dowager and with 2 of the late emperor's brothers. She imprisoned the regents who had thought they would control her, executed one, and ordered 2 others to commit suicide. And at the age of 26, a woman who had entered the palace as a 5th-rank concubine found herself as co-regent of the largest empire on earth. She would not stop there. I want to pause for a moment on something, because this pattern, a woman of slave or low-rank origin entering a palace, rising through the hierarchy to a position of extraordinary power, is something we have now seen in 3 different empires on 3 different continents in this story. Hurrem Sultan in Constantinople, Kursam Sultan in Topkapi, and now Cixi in the Forbidden City. These are not coincidences. They're a function of a specific political structure. An absolute monarchy, where the ruler's personal relationships are political relationships, where the path to power runs through the bedchamber and the nursery, rather than through elections or inheritance.
and where the people officially excluded from formal power have the most to gain from finding informal routes to it. The eunuchs of the Forbidden City stand. Odd this completely. By the height of the Ming dynasty, there were 70,000 of them serving within the palace walls. They had undergone castration, a procedure that in many cases involved the complete removal of the external genitalia, for the specific purpose of being trusted inside the inner courts, where no intact man was permitted. Their sacrifice purchased them proximity, and proximity in a world where the emperor was the center of everything purchased influence that could translate into enormous wealth and power. By the Qing dynasty, the number had reduced to 9,000, but the principle was the same. The eunuchs were the nervous system of the palace, carrying messages, controlling information flow, managing access to the imperial presence. The most powerful eunuch of the late king was a man named Lai Lianying, who served Cixi with an apparent devotion that she reciprocated with extraordinary trust. We will come back to Lai Lianying, but first, Guangxu. Cixi's nephew was selected as emperor in 1875 at the age of 3, when the previous emperor died without an heir. She chose him deliberately. A child young enough to need a regent, the son of her own sister, someone she had known since birth.
She was not choosing a ruler. She was choosing a vehicle for continued power. For a while, the arrangement worked as she intended. Guangxu grew up inside the Forbidden City under her supervision.
He was educated, serious, genuinely interested in governance. He showed promise. And as he grew older, that promise began to manifest in ways that Cixi had not anticipated and did not welcome. By the 1890s, China was in crisis. The Qing dynasty had suffered humiliating defeats to France, to Japan, to Western powers who extracted unequal treaties and territorial concessions with apparent ease. The Forbidden City was the center of an empire that was visibly rotting. And Guangxu, now in his late 20s and nominally ruling in his own name, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to reform China. In the summer of 1898, under the influence of reformist intellectuals Kang Yaowei and Liang Qichao, Guangxu issued a series of edicts that modern historians call the 100 Days Reform. In 103 days, he attempted to modernize China's educational system, its military structure, its civil service examinations, its system of government. He looked at Meiji Japan, where CH had successfully transformed itself from a feudal society into a modern state within a generation, and saw a model. And he almost certainly included among his reform plans the removal of Cixi from her position of influence. Cixi found out. On the 21st of September 1898, she launched her coup. She had Guangxu placed under house arrest. She had 6 of his key reformist supporters executed in public. She had Kang Yaowei and Liang Qichao hunted. Both escaped, eventually reaching Japan. She reversed all of the reforms. All 103 days of work annulled. And then she did something that, in retrospect, tells you everything about the relationship between these two people. She had his favorite concubine killed. The Pearl concubine, known in Chinese as Zhenfei, which means precious, was a young woman of unusual intelligence who had supported Guangxu's reform efforts, reportedly encouraged him, and served as something like a genuine partner to a man who had no other real allies in the palace. Cixi had always disliked her, and in 1900, when the Boxer Rebellion brought the Eight-Nation Alliance marching on Beijing and the imperial court prepared to flee the city, Cixi gave an order. According to accounts that had been passed down through palace records, the Pearl concubine refused to accompany Cixi in the flight from the city. She asked, or begged, depending on the account, that the Guangxu emperor be allowed to stay in Beijing to negotiate with the foreign powers directly. This was a political position, and it was the wrong one to take in that moment. Cixi ordered her eunuchs to throw the Pearl concubine into a palace well. She was 24 years old. The well is still there today. Tourists visit it. It is a small opening in the stone courtyard, barely large enough for the purpose to which it was put. Tour guides mention it with a certain careful neutrality. The palace records that describe what happened are less neutral. Guangxu spent the next 8 years under house arrest on a small island called Yingtai, within the Zhongnanhai complex adjacent to the Forbidden City. He could not communicate freely with the outside world. His physicians were not permitted to speak directly to him. His contact with virtually everyone was mediated through Cixi's network of surveillance. He kept a diary. In those diary entries in the autumn of 1908, there is a line that historians have found, both moving and deeply significant. Cixi was ill. Everyone knew it. The end was clearly approaching. And Guangxu wrote, "I am very ill, but I feel that the old Buddha will surely die before me." He believed he was going to outlive her. He had waited 10 years. He was 37. She was 74 and dying. His moment to resume his reforms, to rebuild what she had torn down, perhaps to finally become the emperor he had intended to be, was nearly at hand. And then on the morning of the 14th of November 1908, he began screaming from stomach pain. A story preserved in the family records of Pu Liang, who served as a minister of rites in the final days of the dynasty, describes what happened that morning. Lai Lianying, Cixi's chief eunuch, her most trusted servant, the man who had managed her personal affairs for decades, was seen leaving Cixi's chambers early that morning. He was carrying a bowl of yogurt. The yogurt was bound, according to the account, for the emperor's breakfast table. By the time the imperial physician arrived at Yingtai Island, Guangxu was dead. 22 hours later, Cixi died. The official imperial records recorded his death as natural causes, a progression of chronic illness, kidney failure, ilia, the accumulated damage of years of confinement. Physicians who had treated him were forbidden from recording certain observations. The dynasty closed its files, and for 100 years the question of what actually killed the Guangxu emperor remained officially unanswered. Then came 2008. A team of Chinese researchers from the National Committee for the Compilation of Qing History, the China Institute of Atomic Energy, the Forensic Laboratory of the Beijing Police, and China Central Television spent 5 years examining the emperor's remains. They analyzed his hair, his bones, the clothes he'd been buried in.
The results were unambiguous.
A single strand of hair 10 inches long showed arsenic levels 2,400 times higher than those found in ordinary people. His clothes, when tested, showed the highest concentration of arsenic in the fabric covering his stomach region, consistent with a dose that had been ingested rather than applied externally. The total arsenic found in his hair, clothing, and remaining physical samples exceeded 200 milligrams. An ordinary person, the researchers noted, will die from ingesting between 60 and 200 milligrams of arsenic, the scientists concluded in his official report, using the precise and careful language of forensic science, that the Guangxu emperor died of acute arsenic poisoning. The poison was administered in a single large dose, not accumulated over time, not chronic exposure. One dose, almost certainly in a single meal. Chu Chengru, the deputy director of the National Committee for the Compilation of Qing History, was asked who was responsible. He said only one person could have made the decision. The conclusion of a century of suspicion, confirmed by nuclear science and forensic chemistry in 2008. The mastermind, he said, was the Empress Dowager. She had waited until the very last possible moment. She was dying. She knew it. And she could not allow the possibility that the man she'd imprisoned for 10 years, the man who had written in his diary that he expected to outlive her, the man who had tried to drag her empire into the 20th century, would walk free and undo everything she had built. So she sent a bowl of yogurt. And in doing so, she did not merely kill an emperor. If the historian Joseph Escherich's analysis is correct, and it is shared by many of his colleagues, she may have killed something considerably large. Had Guangxu outlived Cixi and been able to restart his reforms, China might have pursued a path toward constitutional monarchy. The revolution that followed in 1911, the dynasty that collapsed in 1912, the decades of chaos and conflict that came after, all of it might have unfolded differently, or not happened at all. A bowl of yogurt, 2,400 times the normal arsenic content, the end of a dynasty,
and possibly the redirection of the largest nation on earth. When we talk about poison in the royal courts of history, this is what we are ultimately talking about. Not just the chemistry of arsenic, not just the mechanics of court intrigue. We are talking about the moments when a single private decision made in secrecy within walls that kept every secret, reached out and changed the course of history for hundreds of millions of people who never knew the walls existed. Now, here is something that might surprise you given everything we have just discussed. The emperors of China were not always killing each other with elixirs of immortality. Sometimes they were doing something even stranger. They were killing themselves with them. Because for much of Chinese history, long before the Guangxu emperor, long before the Forbidden City was even built, the Chinese imperial courts had been obsessed with one particular problem. Not how to take power, not how to hold it, but how to hold it forever. The search for an elixir that would defeat death itself is one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of the human obsession with H-power. And the story of what was actually inside those elixirs, and what it was actually doing to the emperors who drank them, is something that manages to be both darkly comic and profoundly strange. That is where we are headed next. Let me tell you something that reframes everything we have discussed so far in this story. Every case we have explored, the Borgias and their Cantarella, Catherine de' Medici and her cabinet of suspicion, La Vorsar
and her black masses, the Ottoman mothers fighting for their sons, Sixi and her bowl of yogurt. Every single one of them involved poison as a weapon, something one person did to another, a deliberate act of harm carried out in secret against an enemy, or a rival or a threat. But what if I told you that some of the most extraordinary poisonings in the history of the Chinese imperial courts involved no enemy at all, no rival, no conspiracy, no secret hand in the dark? What if the emperor handed himself the poison in a golden cup on a red silk cushion, while his entire court bowed and wished him 10,000 years of life? This is the story of the elixir of immortality. And it is, depending on how you look at it, either one of the darkest chapters in the history of human ambition, or one of the most accidentally hilarious, possibly both. Let us begin at the very beginning. Around 210 years before the Common Era, the most powerful man in the world was dying. His name was Ying Zheng, and he had spent the previous 2 decades doing something no one in Chinese history had ever managed. He had conquered all 6 of the rival kingdoms and unified them under a single throne. He called himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, and having accomplished the impossible, he found himself confronted with the one problem that absolute power cannot solve. He was going to die. This was not an abstract concern. Qin Shi Huang was, by multiple historical accounts, terrified of death in a way that went beyond ordinary anxiety. He had elevated walkways and covered roads installed throughout his palaces so that he would never have to walk in the open air. Every window was curtained. He changed his sleeping location unpredictably from night to night so that no one would know where to find him. And he sent his court physicians, his Taoist alchemists, his fangshi, his masters of the methods, on an increasingly desperate search for something that would let him keep everything he had built. He needed an elixir of immortality. The alchemists went to work.
They brought him cinnabar, a gorgeous fire-red mineral that occurs naturally in certain rock formations and was prized in ancient China for its color, its beauty, and its perceived connection to life itself. In Chinese, cinnabar is called danjia, cinnabar sand. The character for Dan, a crucible with a piece of red mineral inside, became the root of the word for elixir, for alchemy, for the sacred arts of life extension.
And cinnabar, heated in a furnace, releases mercury, the silver liquid metal that seems to have a life of its own, rolling and separating and reforming, never corroding, never dying. To an alchemist in 200 BCE, this was not a poison. This was proof.
Here was a mineral that transformed in fire and produced something that behaved like nothing else in nature.
Surely this was the key. Mix it with gold, which never tarnishes.
Add sulfur, which burns but is not destroyed. Combine these with jade and arsenic and lead, and the various other substances that the Taoist tradition associated with longevity and divine power.
Heat the mixture in a crucible.
Reduce wine.
Tea. Refine it and present the result to the emperor in the most beautiful vessel you possess. The emperor drank it. He died at 49, probably of mercury poisoning, somewhere on a tour of his empire. Now, here is the thing that makes this story extraordinary. It was not a one-time mistake. It was not a lesson that the next emperor learned from. Over the following 14 centuries, the pattern repeated itself with a regularity that, from a modern perspective, is almost difficult to believe. Emperor after emperor, dynasty after dynasty, reached the same conclusion. I have more power than any human being alive. I have everything, and I refuse to give it up. And they turned to these same alchemists, who prepared the same toxic mixtures and died the same deaths. The worst dynasty for this particular problem was the Tang. The Tang dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 of the Common Era, is considered one of the high points of Chinese civilization. The arts flourished.
Trade routes opened across Central Asia. Poetry reached heights that Chinese scholars still consider unmatched.
The capital, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, was perhaps the most cosmopolitan city on earth, drawing merchants and
diplomats and scholars from across the known world, and at least 5 of its emperors drank themselves to death with immortality elixirs.
Let me introduce you to Emperor Xianzong, the 12th ruler of the Tang dynasty, who came to the throne in 805 at the age of 27.
For most of his reign, Xianzong was a capable and energetic ruler.
He suppressed rebellions, restored some of the central authority the dynasty had lost, and governed with what his advisors described as a clear head and a practical disposition. His official court records include a specific moment in 810 when his advisor Lai Fan warned him explicitly by name against the dangers of seeking immortality elixirs. Lai Fan quoted an earlier poem, "Better to drink good wine and wear fine silk than to seek an immortality medicine from which mistakes are often made." Xianzong, according to the old Book of Tang, felt deeply that this was correct. He agreed with his advisor. He understood the danger.
He dismissed the alchemists. And then, 8 years later, in 818, he hired a new alchemist named Lai Chun and started drinking elixirs again.
His advisors were horrified. They suggested with remarkable practicality that the emperor require Lai Chun to eat his own concoctions for a full year before the emperor tried them himself. A basic clinical trial, essentially, 200 years before anyone had a name for such a thing. Xianzong was not interested. He was so enchanted with Lai Chun that he made him the governor of an entire prefecture, an unthinkable honor for a lowly alchemist, specifically so he would have easier access to Mount Tiantai, where Lai claimed his ingredients grew. Jianzong began missing court sessions. He became erratic.
Palace staff were executed for trivial offenses, and in 820, his son took the throne as Emperor Muzong, and within a month of his father's death, had the alchemist Lai Chun beaten, and then, within a few years, started drinking elixirs himself.
At this point, I have to ask you something.
Are you as fascinated by this as I am? Because this is not stupidity.
These were intelligent, educated people who ruled the largest empire on earth. This is something else. This is what happens when the fear of death collides with absolute power. When you have everything and the only thing you cannot have is more time, the brain starts reaching for possibilities that it would otherwise dismiss. The Tang. Dynasty poet Bai Jui, one of the most celebrated poets in Chinese history, whose work is still read today, knew this from personal experience. He watched his friends and colleagues, many of them brilliant and accomplished men, die one after another from the elixirs they had taken in pursuit of immortality. He wrote about it with a mixture of grief and incredulity that resonates across more than 1,000 years. At leisure, he wrote, he thought of his old friends, and they seemed to appear before his eyes. All fell ill or died suddenly. None of them lived through middle age. And then the line that I find most striking. Only he had not taken the elixir, and yet he contrarily lived on, an old man. He survived by refusing. In a court culture where the pursuit of immortality was essentially expected of any ambitious and sophisticated person, Bai Jui looked at the death toll and said,
"No, thank you, I will pass."
And he was right. He died at 74, an extraordinary age for his time, while the emperors who drank their golden elixirs died in their 30s and 40s. By the time the Tang dynasty ended in 907, the catastrophe of elixir poisoning was widely understood. The physician and naturalist, Lai Shizhen, writing his monumental Compendium of Materia Medica in 1578, a work that took him 27 years and remains one of the great achievements of Chinese scholarship, condemned the entire tradition with a directness that is almost jarring, coming from the measured language of classical Chinese medicine. The alchemists, he wrote, will never realize that the human body, which thrives on water and the cereals, is unable to sustain such heavy substances as gold and other minerals within the stomach and intestines for any length of time. How blind it is in the pursuit of longevity to lose one's life instead. You would think that this would be the end of the story. Lai Shizhen says it plainly. The Tang emperors had demonstrated it repeatedly. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet, meet the Jiajing Emperor, 12th ruler of the Ming dynasty. He came to the throne in 1521 and reigned for 45 years. His name, Jiajing, meant admirable tranquility. He was not, by any reasonable historical assessment, tranquil. And what he did in pursuit of immortality stands as possibly the most extreme case in the entire history of this particular obsession. The Jiajing Emperor was a devoted follower of
Taoism.
He built himself a complex of palaces and temples in the western section of Beijing, outside the Forbidden City, which he essentially abandoned. And he spent his reign there, surrounded by eunuchs, Taoist priests, and a rotating group of trusted advisors who were selected primarily for their ability to write the highly stylized form of Taoist prayer poetry that the emperor required for his ceremonies. His obsession was with a concept called Qing, Qi, Shen, the three treasures of Taoist internal alchemy. And to produce the highest quality elixir, he believed he needed the purest possible ingredients. Among those ingredients was the morning dew collected from the virgin pure. So the emperor ordered that every morning hundreds of young girls, some as young as 8, were sent out into the imperial gardens to collect the dew before the sun rose. They were fed only mulberry leaves and rainwater. The emperor and his alchemists believed that this strict diet would keep the girls pure. Any girl who became ill was removed. The regime was designed not for the well-being of the girls, but for the quality of the substance they produced. I want to take a moment here to acknowledge that. To what I am describing is deeply disturbing. These were children being treated as raw material for what their captor believed was a life extension experiment. This happened in documented historical record within the walls of one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, carried out by a man who considered himself the son of heaven. And then, in 1542, the girls fought back. On a particular night in the autumn of that year, a group of 16 palace women crept into the chambers where the judging emperor was sleeping. They had obtained a hemp rope. Their plan was to strangle him.
The rope was missing. The strangling cord was knotted incorrectly around the emperor's throat. It did not kill him, but it rendered him unconscious. One of the 16 women, a girl named Yang Jinlian, lost her nerve and ran to alert the empress.
The empress arrived. The emperor was revived.
And the 16 women were arrested. All 16 were executed by slow slicing, the traditional Chinese punishment reserved for the most serious crimes against the imperial person. This was a process involving, according to Ming Dynasty records, approximately 3,000 incisions administered over multiple days, removed, eyeing portions of the body methodically until death occurred. The families of the women were also punished. 10 relatives were beheaded. 20 others were enslaved. The judging emperor, despite having just survived an assassination attempt carried out by the children he was exploiting for his immortality project, did not stop.
He ordered tighter restrictions. He brought in 300 new girls the following year. In 1552, he lowered the age requirement and brought in 200 more. In 1555, he added 150 girls under the age of 8. In 1567, after 45 years on the throne, the judging emperor died at the age of 59 of mercury poisoning from his immortality elixir. The irony is precise and complete. He spent his entire reign poisoning himself to avoid death, while the children he exploited were executed for trying to stop him. The last emperor in Chinese history documented to have died of elixir poisoning was the Yongzheng emperor of the Qing dynasty, who died in 1735. By that point, the practice of external alchemy, consuming physical substances to achieve immortality, had largely been replaced by what Taoist practitioners called Niden or internal alchemy. The idea was that the body itself could be transformed into the alchemical furnace through meditation, breath control, diet, and specific practices. The immortal body could be grown inside the mortal one. This was safer in the obvious sense that it did not involve drinking mercury. It was also, as a centuries-long experiment would eventually demonstrate, equally unsuccessful at producing actual immortality. But here is the detail from this entire story that I find most extraordinary, and I want to leave you with it before we move on. Gunpowder was discovered in China during the Tang dynasty, the same period when the Tang emperors were dying from their immortality elixirs. It was discovered as a byproduct of alchemical experimentation. The Taoist alchemists working in their furnaces with their cinnabar and their saltpeter and their sulfur, mixing and heating and combining in their search for the elixir that would defeat death, accidentally invented the substance that would become the foundation of modern warfare. They were trying to cheat death. They discovered how to deliver it more efficiently. If you find that darkly funny, I think you are responding correctly. And if you find yourself thinking, surely no one today would do anything so irrational as slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of life extension, trusting in substances that have no scientific basis for their claimed effects, spending extraordinary resources in the hope of defeating death. Well, the World of Chinese magazine reporting on this history noted the tech billionaire Peter Thiel, who has spoken publicly about planning to have his body cryogenically frozen after death in the hope that future technology will revive him. Other Silicon Valley figures have poured millions into longevity research, blood transfusion experiments, and life extension protocols that mainstream science regards with considerable skepticism. The emperor in his palace with his golden cup, and his alchemist and his terrifying certainty that death was a problem that could be solved if only one found the right formula. He is not quite as distant from us as we might like to think. Now, all of this raises a question that we have not yet addressed directly. Throughout this entire story, poison has moved through kitchens and banquet halls and private chambers and golden cups. And at the courts of Rome, of France, of the Ottoman Empire, of China, the people who wielded power were acutely, desperately aware of the threat. So what did they do about it? They hired someone whose entire job was to eat the food first. The men known as poison tasters, the pregastators of the Roman emperors, the gauleteurs of the French court, the imperial tasters of the Ottoman sultans. These were real people with real jobs who sat down at the table before the emperor sat down, and ate everything that would eventually be served to the most powerful person in the room. They were the first line of defense against exactly the kind of poisoning we've been discussing all evening, and the story of who they were, what their lives were actually like, and whether any of this worked is considerably stranger than you might expect.
That is where we are headed next.
Imagine for a moment that you are offered a job. The pay is decent.
The food is extraordinary. The finest cuisine in the kingdom, prepared by the best cooks that any amount of imperial money can hire.
You eat at the royal table in the royal household, surrounded by the trappings of power and privilege.
The only catch is this.
Before every meal, before every cup of wine, before every dish of fruit or plate of roasted meat that reaches the royal mouth, you eat it first. Because if it is poisoned, you die instead. This was a real job.
For approximately 2,000 years of recorded history, across the Roman Empire and the medieval courts of Europe, the Mughal palaces of India, the Forbidden City of China, and the bunkers of the Second World War,
real human beings held this position. They had titles, protocols, and in some courts, considerable social status. They ate the most expensive food in the world every single day. And every single day they were the first person to find out whether that food was going to kill someone. Today we're going to look at the people on the other side of every story we have told in this series. Not the poisoners, not the victims, the ones who stood between them. And I have to tell you up front, the history of poison tasters is in equal parts genuinely fascinating and deeply absurd. Because, as it turns out, the elaborate system that royal courts developed over centuries to protect their rulers from poison had a fundamental flaw that anyone with a passing familiarity with how poisons actually work would have noticed immediately. But we will get to that first.
Mithridates.
King Mithridates VI of Pontus, who reigned on the southern shore of the Black Sea from 120 to 63 years before the Common Era, was arguably the most poison-obsessed ruler in all of recorded history, and he had excellent reasons for his obsession. His father, Mithridates V, had been assassinated by poison. His mother, who served as regent after his father's death, was widely suspected of planning to do the same to him. He grew up watching everyone around him use poison as a political tool, and he reached an understandable conclusion. The only way to be safe was to make himself impossible to kill. So he began conducting experiments, working with a team of botanists, physicians, and the Agari, a group of Scythian shamans who served as his personal toxicological consultants. Mithridates spent years developing what he hoped would be a universal antidote. Over 50 ingredients, including small amounts of the very poisons he feared. He consumed these daily in a tablet the size of an almond, ground into powder, and mixed with honey. And more remarkably, he consumed tiny amounts of various poisons themselves, incrementally over time, in the hope of building immunity through gradual exposure. This practice now has a name in modern medicine. It is called Mithridatism, and it actually works for certain classes of poison administered in carefully calibrated doses over sufficient time. Mithridates, working with no modern pharmacology and no understanding of the underlying mechanisms, had essentially discovered the principle that would later give us vaccines. For most of his life, this was enough. He waged war against Rome, was defeated, waged war again, was defeated again. He outlived enemies, rivals, and betrayers. He reached his 70s in robust health, an extraordinary achievement for any man of his era. And then, in 63 years before the Common Era, facing final defeat by the Roman general Pompey, with his own sons rebelling against him, Mithridates decided that the time had come to die. He took out his poison. He swallowed it. Nothing happened. He tried more. Still nothing. He had spent decades building immunity so thorough that his own suicide attempt failed completely. According to the ancient historian Cassius Dio, he then tried to open a vein. He was weakened by age, and his hand was unsteady. Eventually, according to most accounts, he had to ask one of his guards to run him through with a sword. The man who had defeated poison for 50 years could not die by his own hand. He had, in trying to protect himself from murder, made himself impossible to kill. Now the irony of Mithridates' story is instructive, because while he was developing his immunity on the shores of the Black Sea, the Roman emperors he was fighting against were developing a different approach entirely. They hired someone else to eat first. The Latin term was pregustator, from pre, meaning before, and gustar, meaning to taste. In Rome's system of government, where political assassination was essentially a recognized tool of statecraft, and where poison had been normalized as a method of removing rivals, since at least the 1st century before the Common Era, the emperors began assigning specific individuals to taste everything before it reached the imperial mouth. These were typically slaves or freedmen. Not people who chose this occupation from a menu of appealing career options, but people assigned to it by the logic of their social position. They were expendable in the brutal arithmetic of Roman society in a way that senators and generals were not. They ate the emperor's food.
They drank the emperor's wine. They tasted the emperor's fruit. And if they survived, the emperor proceeded to eat. Here is a question worth sitting with. Would you have wanted this job?
I think most of us, when we imagine it, picture something like a moment of heroic sacrifice, a loyal servant stepping between their master and death, and perhaps some of them did experience it that way. But think about the actual texture of the life. Every meal for your entire career you eat first, knowing that what you're about to swallow might be the last thing that passes your lips. Every dinner, every banquet, every midnight cup of wine, every day for years, the same calculus. Is this the one? Even if you got used to the routine, that background awareness never quite went away. And then consider Helotus, the taster of the Emperor Claudius, the fourth emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a genuinely capable ruler who reformed Rome's bureaucracy, extended its road network, and successfully conquered parts of Britain during his 13 years in power. Claudius had a food taster. Claudius was careful. Claudius was, by most accounts, not a paranoid man, but a prudent one. On the 13th October in the year 54 of the Common Era, Claudius sat down to a banquet. Among the dishes served was a platter of mushrooms. He was particularly fond of them. Helotus, according to multiple ancient sources, tasted them. No immediate ill effects. Claudius ate. And then over the following hours he developed severe abdominal pain, vomiting, excessive salivation, difficulty breathing, and a dramatic drop in blood pressure. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms, conducted by physicians at the University of Maryland in the 21st century, concluded that the mushrooms most likely contained muscarine, a deadly toxin that attacks the nervous system. Claudius died, and the prime suspects included Helotus himself. Let that sit for a moment. The man hired specifically to prevent the emperor from being poisoned was one of the most likely candidates for having poisoned him. Ancient historians, including Tacitus, suggest that Helotus had been working with the Empress Agrippina, who wanted to secure the throne for her son Nero, and had administered or enabled the poison from his unique position of access and trust. Nero, who succeeded Claudius, did not punish Helotus. He kept him on as chief,
Steward and taster.
The man who most likely helped kill one emperor continued to serve the next. But this was only the first layer of the problem. Because even if Helotus had been completely loyal, completely honest, eating every dish with genuine intent to protect his emperor, the system still had a flaw that would have made it ineffective. Arsenic, for instance, does not kill immediately. In 1867, 20 guests sat down to a meal at an Illinois hotel and ate biscuits that had been mistakenly made with arsenic instead of flour. One guest fell ill shortly after rising from the table. Others became sick over the following hours. Still others showed no symptoms for considerably longer, even though they had all consumed the arsenic at exactly the same moment. The difference was determined by each person's individual body weight, metabolic rate, how much food they had already eaten, and various other factors. Now imagine a royal poison taster in the medieval period. He eats a bite of the king's food. He waits. No immediate symptoms, no clutching of the throat, no dramatic collapse, no indication of anything wrong. He signals that the food is safe. The king eats.
And 2 hours later,
The slow poison that had been carefully calibrated to act on a delay begins its work. The taster would also be ill, eventually, or might not show symptoms for days if the dose was calibrated precisely enough. And by then the king would already be dead. The courts of medieval Europe knew none of this, of course. They developed their protocols in the belief that poison acted quickly, which it sometimes did, and sometimes spectacularly did not. The tasting rituals they developed were elaborate, ceremonial, and in retrospect more effective as theatre than as protection. In the English royal household by the 15th century, the tasting of the king's food had become an extraordinary production. A 1565 account of a feast held for the installation of an Archbishop of York described the procedure in careful detail. Servants called sewers, from the French asseoir, to set, would carry each dish from the kitchen to what was called the credence table. The word credenza, which today refers to a simple piece of office furniture, takes its name from this practice. The credence table was where each dish received its credence, its proof of safety, before reaching the royal table. At the credit. Hence a table, appointed tasters would sample each dish. Anything with a crust, a meat pie, a pastry, had the crust broken open and a piece of bread dipped inside. Servants who carried dishes were required to eat from the very dish they had carried. Armed guards prevented any unauthorized person from approaching the food. Drinks were tested by pouring a few drops into a special basin and drinking from it. The water the king used to wash his hands was poured over a servant's hands first to see if it burned. And the napkins, tablecloths, and even the seat cushions were kissed by servants before the king touched them, presumably in case someone had applied a contact poison to the fabric. To prevent the poisoning of the young Prince Edward, who would later become King Edward VI, his father, Henry VIII, ordered that tasters eat large quantities of the prince's food before the boy tasted anything. Not a polite sample, but a hearty serving of every single item. The milk, the bread, the meat, the eggs, the butter. Everything the child ate, someone ate first. This ritual protection sounds comprehensive. It was, in fact, largely ceremonial, because the court physicians of the Tudor period had no understanding of slow-acting poisons and no awareness of the delay between ingestion and symptom. They were watching for someone to grab their throat and fall over. They were not watching for someone to develop symptoms 4 hours later in a different building. But there is something important here that goes beyond the practical question of whether the tasting actually worked. In courts where power was maintained through display, where the elaborate rituals of protocol and ceremony were themselves a kind of political communication, the poison tasting was not only about actual protection, it was about what the ritual communicated. It said, "This ruler is so valuable that human lives are dedicated to his safety." It said, "This food has been verified. This court is trustworthy. This table is safe." The taster was, among other things, a walking symbol of the seriousness with which the ruler took his own importance. And sometimes the theatre was the point. In 1942, a 24-year-old German secretary named Margot Werlk fled her bombed-out apartment in Berlin and moved to the East Prussian village of Großparch to stay with her mother-in-law. A few kilometers to the west was a heavily fortified military headquarters in the forest, a complex of concrete bunkers and reinforced buildings known as the Wolfschans, the Wolf's Lair. Shortly after arriving, Margot Werlk was summoned by the local mayor and informed that she, along with 14 other young women, had been selected to serve as food tasters for the person who used that headquarters. Adolf Hitler was, among his many other qualities, extraordinarily paranoid about being poisoned. He was convinced that the British were planning to poison him. He was a vegetarian, which meant that everything brought to his table was plant-based. Vegetables, noodle dishes, sauces, exotic fruits. And before any of it reached him, these 15 young women sat down at a long wooden table and ate it first. 5 days a week, a bus would collect them and take them to the barracks in the nearby village of Krausendorf, where Hitler's food was prepared. They would sit down between 11 o'clock and noon. The platters would be brought in, and they would eat. Margot Werlk, in an interview she gave at the age of 95, the first time she had spoken about her wartime role to anyone outside her immediate circle, including to her late husband, described the experience. Ense with a precision that is difficult to forget.
The food was delicious, she said. Only the best vegetables, asparagus, bell peppers, everything you can imagine, always with rice or pasta. The quality was extraordinary.
But she said, "We could never enjoy it. Every day we feared it was going to be our last meal." After the failed assassination attempt of the 20th of July, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated a bomb inside the Wolf's Lair that injured but did not kill Hitler, the security around the compound was dramatically tightened. The food tasters were no longer allowed to go home at night. They were housed in a vacant school building. Each morning at 8, an SS officer would shout, "Margot, get up," from beneath her window. She never saw Hitler. She saw his German shepherd Blondie, who often played in the courtyard. She saw the SS guards. And every day she sat down at that table and ate the food that the most powerful and destructive man in the world would eat an hour later. Towards the end of 1944, with the Soviet Red Army closing in, a sympathetic lieutenant pulled Margot Werlk aside and told her to leave. He put her on a train to Berlin. She went. Our 14 women stayed behind in Rustenburg, where their families lived. When Soviet troops overran the Wolf's Lair in January of 1945, all 14 were shot. Margot Werlk kept her secret for 70 years. She did not tell her husband. She did not tell her friends. She carried it quietly for the rest of her life, until a newspaper interview published near her 95th birthday finally brought the story into the public record. She died in April of 2014 at the age of 96. This system of poison tasting, 2,000 years of human beings eating first, so that someone more important could eat second, never really solved the problem it was designed to address. Slow poisons bypassed it. Corrupt tasters enabled it. Contact poisons and airborne substances rendered it irrelevant. Even the most elaborate medieval ceremony, with its 24 bodyguards and its credence tests and its kissed napkins, could not fully close the gap between someone who wanted to poison a king and the king himself. What the system did more reliably than anything else was communicate something. It said,
I know the danger. I take the danger seriously. I have people whose lives are dedicated to standing between me and death. And as long as you believe...
I am protected, you might hesitate before you try. The power of the ritual was not always in the protection it offered. Sometimes it was in the fear it created in the mind of anyone considering acting against the ruler, which brings us perhaps inevitably to the other side of that equation, because as elaborate as these protective systems were, as carefully constructed as the rituals and the tasters and the antidotes and the theories and the ceremonies had become, sometimes the poison still got through. And when it did, what happened next was often more carefully managed than the poisoning itself. Because in the courts we've been exploring all evening, the truth of what had happened was frequently the most dangerous thing of all. The cover-ups, the sealed records, the altered reports, the physicians who wrote the wrong cause of death, the families who burned the evidence, the rulers who closed the files. That is the final chapter of the poison story, and it is where we are headed next. There is a particular kind of document that tells you more by its absence than by anything it could have said. A sealed chest, a burned file, a coroner's report that reads, "Accidental death when tea." The evidence on the body says something else entirely. A king who orders his own investigation shut down, not because the investigation found nothing, but because it found too much. This is what I keep thinking about as we approach the end of this story. We have spent the previous hours looking at poison as a weapon, as a tool of ambition, as a form of art practiced by some of the most sophisticated and ruthless minds of the past 2,000 years. But I want to argue that the cover-ups, the deliberate erasure, the sealed records, the official versions written over the real ones, are perhaps the most revealing part of the whole picture, because what gets hidden, and why, tells us something that the poison itself never could. Let me start in France.
The year is 1682.
The Chamber Ardente, the burning court, established by Louis XIV to investigate the wave of poisonings that had terrified Versailles, has been operating for 3 years. It has issued 319 subpoenas. It has arrested over 400 people. It has held 210 sessions in the basement of the Paris Arsenal, a room lit only by torches, with 13 magistrates in black robes. It has executed 36 people, including the poisoner Lavoisier, burned Al. I've on the 22nd of February 1680, and now, in the summer of 1682, Louis XIV orders it to stop. He orders the documents sealed. He orders the witness testimonies locked in a chest controlled by his personal secretary, guarded. He orders the investigation over. Why? The answer is in the name that kept appearing in the testimonies, in the confessions extracted under torture, in the statements given by Lavoisier's daughter Marguerite, and by various accomplices who had nothing left to lose. The name of Françoise Athanaïse de Rochechouart, the Marquise de Montespan, the woman who had been Louis XIV's closest companion for more than a decade, the mother of 7 of his acknowledged children, the de facto Queen of Versailles in everything but formal title. The chief of the Paris police, La Reynie, had become convinced that Montespan was deeply involved. He wrote in his private notes that her story had the appearance of truth. He believed she had purchased love potions and powders from Lavoisier beginning in 1667. He believed she may have attempted to poison a younger rival, the Duchess of Fontanges. He believed she may have attempted to poison the king himself. Louis knew all of this. Reynie reported to him directly, and Louis chose the sealed chest. I find this choice genuinely fascinating, not as a moral judgment, but as a political calculation. Consider what Louis was weighing. On one side, the truth, justice, the full accountability of everyone who had participated in poisoning, witchcraft, and murder in the shadow of Versailles. On the other side, the revelation that the woman who had shared his bed for 13 years, who had sat beside him at state dinners, who had helped manage his court and bear his children, that woman had been buying poisons and commissioning black masses from a street poisoner in Paris. What would that do to the image of the Sun King? What would it do to the divine legitimacy of the monarchy, which rested in part on the premise that God had blessed this court and this ruler with particular favor? La Reynie, the man who had run the investigation, who had personally overseen the execution of 36 people for their involvement in the poisoning network, understood the calculation perfectly. He wrote afterward, in the notes that survived the sealing of the official record, a line that I think is one of the most precise summaries of political cover.
Up in all of history, the enormity of their crimes proved their safeguard. The crimes were so large, so close to the center of power, involving names so prominent and connections so deep, that prosecuting them fully would have been more destructive to the regime than leaving them unpunished. The very magnitude of what had happened made it untouchable. The chest stayed sealed for decades. The full records were not made available to historians until the 19th century, and even then, with the official testimony finally accessible, the question of exactly what Montespan knew and did cannot be definitively answered, because Louis had already burned the documents that would have resolved it. He burned them himself, according to scholars who have studied what survives, historian Lynn Mollenauer, writing about the affair of the poisons in the 21st century, noted something that strikes me as deeply important. Because the king burned the documents that held the answers, the mystery is, in her words, ultimately unsolvable. A king so devoted to his own image that he destroyed the evidence of what happened in his own court, and in doing so made the question permanent. Now let us cross the Channel. In September 1560, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was at Windsor Castle with Queen Elizabeth I when a messenger arrived with news from Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire. His wife, Amy Robsart, had been found dead. She was 28 years old. She'd been alone in the house, having sent every member of the household staff to the Abingdon Fair earlier that day, apparently insisting on their absence with unusual urgency, becoming angry at those who suggested they might stay. When the servants returned that evening, they found her at the foot of a staircase, 8 steps. Her neck was broken. There were 2 deep wounds on the back of her head. The coroner's inquest returned a verdict of accidental death, or in the formal language of the time, death by misfortune. I want to sit with this case for a moment because it encapsulates something about cover-ups that the Louis XIV situation only partially illuminates. With Louis, we have documented evidence of deliberate suppression. The sealed chest, the burned documents, the personal secretary with the key. We know the mechanism of the concealment. With Amy Robsart, we have something stranger, and in some ways more unsettling. We have a verdict that may be honest, delivered by a process that was demonstrably compromised, about a death that changed the course of English history in ways that no one living in 1560 could have anticipated. Let me tell you the context. For the first 2 years of Elizabeth's reign, her relationship with Robert Dudley had been the talk of every court in Europe. She had created a special position for him, Master of the Horse, that kept him constantly at her side. She had arranged for him to have a chamber near hers. She spent hours with him daily. The Spanish ambassador, de Quadra, wrote back to Madrid with barely disguised disbelief. The Queen of England seemed to be conducting herself as though she intended to marry this man. This was a problem for several reasons. Dudley's family background was politically toxic. His father and grandfather had both been executed as traitors. He was widely disliked at court. He was already married. His wife, Amy, lived quietly in rented houses in the English countryside, moving from one to another, apparently unwell, apparently afraid. Contemporary sources mentioned rumors that she feared being poisoned. The Spanish ambassador, de Quadra, wrote home in March of 1560, months before Amy's death, that he had heard from a reliable source that Dudley had sent to poison his wife. And then, 6 months later, Amy sent her entire household to a fair, remained alone in the house, and was found dead. Robert Dudley had the inquest conducted by a jury that, according to Amy's half-brother, he had packed with his own people. The jury returned the verdict he needed. The case was officially closed. But here is the thing that I cannot stop thinking about. If Dudley had arranged to have his wife killed, it was the single stupidest act of his life, because it made the marriage he desired impossible. You cannot become the husband of the Queen of England, while the whole of Europe is whisper. Eyeing that you murdered your first wife to make room for her. Elizabeth, who was many things but was never stupid, understood this immediately. She cooled toward him. She confined him when word of Amy's death first reached court. The whispers that had surrounded their relationship calcified into something that could never be fully dissolved. Whatever actually happened on that staircase in Cumnor Place, accident, suicide, cancer-weakened bones that fractured spontaneously, or something darker, Amy Robsart's death made Elizabeth the Virgin Queen. Not because Elizabeth chose to remain unmarried as a political statement, but because the man she may have intended to marry became, after the death of his wife, unmarriable. The coroner's report, discovered in the National Archives in 2008, is compatible with an accidental fall. It is also compatible with other things. After nearly 500 years, it cannot be resolved, and the Tudor dynasty ended without an heir as a consequence. Whether you believe it was accident, murder, or something in between, the outcome was the same. The cover-up, if there was one, or the ambiguity of an unresolved death, shaped the throne of England for a generation. NT to pause here and share a thought that I keep returning to as I go through these cases. In all 3 of the stories we've examined tonight, La Voisin and the affair of the poisons, the murder of Guangzhou that we explored earlier, and Amy Robsart, the cover-up was not the exception.
It was the expected outcome. Courts that ran on poison as a political tool had by necessity also developed systems for managing the aftermath of poison. The physician who wrote the wrong diagnosis,
the courtier who kept his mouth shut, the inquest that returned the verdict that needed to be returned,
The king who burned the files.
Power, as it turns out, is not just the ability to act, it is also the ability to determine what the record says about what happened. And then there is St. Helena.
Napoleon Bonaparte died on the 5th of May 1821 on an island in the South Atlantic Ocean that is roughly 1,200 miles from the nearest mainland. He had been exiled there by the British after his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. He was 51 years old.
The official cause of death was stomach cancer.
In 1961, a Swedish dentist named Sten Forschuffud published an article in the journal Nature, the most prestigious scientific publication in the world. Working with Hamilton Smith of the Glasgow University Forensic Laboratory and Anders Wassane of Sweden, Forschuffud had analyzed a strand of Napoleon's hair taken immediately after his death and preserved for nearly 140 years in a family keepsake. The results were striking. The strand of hair contained arsenic at levels far above what would be expected in a person dying of stomach cancer. The theory Forschuffud proposed was that Napoleon had been deliberately poisoned slowly over an extended period by someone within his inner circle at Longwood House, where he was confined. The prime suspect was Charles Tristan, the Marquis de Montholon, who was Napoleon's most constant companion during the final years of exile, and who received 2 million francs in Napoleon's will. The theory generated decades of debate, scholarly articles, and competing analyses. It became one of the great contested historical questions of the 20th century. And then, in 1980, a British scientist named David Jones made an unexpected discovery that offered an entirely different explanation. Napoleon's bedroom at Longwood House had been decorated with green wallpaper, a pattern with stars.
Green and brown.
And that particular shade of green used in wallpapers across Europe from the 1770s onward was colored with a pigment called Scheele's green, named after the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who invented it in 1778. Scheele's green was cheap, vivid, and spectacularly popular.
It was also copper arsenite. On dry walls it sits harmlessly. But St. Helena is a notoriously damp island, and when the damp encouraged mold to grow on wallpaper containing Scheele's green, an Italian biochemist named Gioi had demonstrated in 1893 that the mold converted the copper arsenite into trimethylacene, a volatile arsenic compound that evaporated off the wallpaper and filled the room with invisible, odorless, slowly accumulating poison. Napoleon slept in that room. He often spent hours there.
Multiple members of his household complained of symptoms consistent with arsenic exposure. Several of them also died. When Jones analyzed a sample of the wallpaper taken in the 1820s and preserved in a Norfolk family scrapbook, he found arsenic at 0.12 grams per square meter, dangerous by any historical standard. So was Napoleon murdered by a royalist agent? Was he slowly poisoned by a companion who stood to inherit? Or did he die slowly and terribly from the wallpaper? In 2008, an Italian research team widened the investigation. They analyzed strands of Napoleon's hair from 4 different periods of his life: childhood, exile, the day of his death, and the day after. They also analyzed hair from his son, Napoleon II, and from his wife, Empress Josephine. All of the samples showed high arsenic levels, roughly 100 times those found in modern individuals used for comparison. Napoleon's arsenic exposure was not confined to St. Helena. It was elevated his entire life, through a childhood, a career of conquest, and a final exile on a damp island in the South Atlantic. The most likely explanation, according to most current scientific opinion, is that Napoleon lived in a world saturated with arsenic. In the medicines he took, in the hair and face powders fashionable in his era, in the water, in the wallpaper, in treatments for the various illnesses of his day. Arsenic was everywhere. His body carried it because his world was full of it. And his stomach, when examined at autopsy, showed damage consistent with cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. Which brand? Brings us back to the cover-up, or rather to the cover-up that did not happen. Because here is what I find most interesting about the Napoleon case. Unlike Louis XIV, no one sealed a chest. Unlike Amy Robsart, no one packed a jury. The official version, stomach cancer, was probably, according to the current weight of evidence, correct, or at least partly correct. And yet, the story of the arsenic wallpaper and the suspected poisoner has refused to die for more than 60 years because it feels more satisfying than the truth. A man who changed the map of Europe, who was exiled to a rock in the ocean by his enemies, who was surrounded by people who might have had reasons to want him gone. Surely that man was murdered. Surely the arsenic in his hair is evidence of a conspiracy, not a coincidence of an era when everyone's hair contained arsenic. We want the cover-up. We want there to be a secret, because the alternative, that Napoleon died of the same stomach cancer that killed his father, in a damp house far from home, attended by people who genuinely could not save him, is somehow not enough of an ending for a life that large. I think about that a lot.
About how much of what we call cove.
Our ups in history is genuine concealment by the powerful Louis XIV with his burning files, Sixie with her falsified medical records, and how much of it is the shape that our imagination imposes on events that were actually just tragic and random and ordinary. The affair of the poisons was real. The sealed chest was real. The burned documents were real. Louis XIV destroyed evidence of crimes committed in his court, and we know this because La Rainey said so and because scholars can see the gaps in what survives. Amy Robsart's broken neck and the 2 wounds on the back of her head are real. The compromised inquest is real. The verdict that served Robert Dudley's interests is real.
But Napoleon's wallpaper was also real.
And the arsenic was everywhere. This is the strange thing about studying poison in history. The substance is so perfect a tool for concealment, tasteless, odorless, mimicking natural disease, leaving traces that disappear over time, that it becomes, after the fact, the explanation we apply to every mysterious death in every court where we know poison was used. We see arsenic in the hair, and we say murder. We see a broken neck on the staircase, and we say Dudley. We see a sealed chest, and we say Louis was protecting his mistress because she was guilty. Sometimes all of that is exactly right. And sometimes the arsenic was in the wallpaper. What the history of poison cover-ups teaches us, if it teaches us anything useful, is a kind of humility about certainty. In the courts we have explored tonight, the record was so thoroughly managed by those in power, the physicians who wrote the wrong diagnosis, the kings who burned the files, the jurors who returned the verdicts they were expected to return, that we cannot always know which deaths were murders and which were simply deaths. The record was made by people who had reasons to control it. We are left with fragments, with a strand of hair in a family scrapbook, with a coroner's report discovered in a national archive 448 years after the fact, with a policeman's private notes that survived because no one thought to burn them along with the official documents, and with the question that hangs over the entire history of poison in the royal courts. How many of the deaths recorded as natural causes were anything but? We will probably never know the full answer to that. But here is what I do know, after.
All the stories we have told in this series. The poison scandals of history are not primarily about chemistry. They are about power, about who gets to act without consequence, who gets to write the official version, who gets to decide what the record says. The poison is just the mechanism. The cover-up is where the real power lives. And that pattern, the powerful determining what gets remembered and what gets erased, did not end when arsenic became detectable, or when forensic science made concealment harder, or when sealed chests were eventually forced open by historians. Which brings us, in the final section of this story, to what all of this left behind. Not just in the historical record, but in the world we actually live in now. What did the poison courts of history give us? What did all of this fear and secrecy and ambition and detection actually produce? The answer, when you look closely, is genuinely surprising. That is what we are going to explore next. Something has been quietly bothering me throughout this entire story, and I want to share it with you now. We have spent hours inside the most gilded rooms in human history. We have sat at the Borgia table and watched every guest calculate their risk. We have walked through Versailles with La Voisin's clients in their little packets of white powder.
We have stood in the Forbidden City on a November morning in 1908 and watched a bowl of yogurt change the fate of an empire. We have followed alchemists chasing immortality and emperors chasing each other and a woman in Berlin eating asparagus under armed guard. And through all of it, I keep returning to the same question.
What did it cost? Not just in lives, though the cost in lives was staggering.
But what did all of this fear, this centuries-long arms race between poisoners and their targets, this obsession with detection and concealment, actually leave behind in the world? The answer, when you look carefully, is something I find genuinely astonishing. It left us medicine, not metaphorically, literally. The modern science of how substances affect the human body. The science that now protects every drug you will ever take, every food additive you will ever consume, every chemical standard enforced by health agencies around the world. That science was born directly from the courts we have been exploring. It was born from the specific, urgent life or death. The need to answer one question that the poison culture of royal courts had made inescapable. How do you know? How do you know this person was poisoned and not simply ill? How do you know the arsenic in the body came from a murderer and not from the wallpaper? How do you know the dose was lethal and not incidental? How do you prove in a court of law, before a jury of people who cannot see inside a human body, what killed someone and why? The poison courts of history did not just kill people. They created the demand for a science that could answer those questions. And the science that emerged from that demand eventually gave us the tools to save far more lives than poison ever took.
Let me walk you through how that happened.
We need to begin in the summer of 1832, in an English village called Plumstead. An 80-year-old farmer named George Boddle drank his morning coffee and was dead by nightfall. His family suspected his grandson, a young man named John Boddle, who had recently purchased arsenic from the local pharmacist, ostensibly for rat control, which was common. An inquest was opened. A chemist named James Marsh, who worked at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, was called by the prosecutor, Tion, to analyze the coffee. Marsh applied the standard test for arsenic of his era. He mixed the suspected substance with hydrogen sulfide and hydrochloric acid and produced a yellow precipitate that indicated arsenic's presence. He was certain of what he had found. He brought his findings to court, but by the time the yellow precipitate was displayed for the jury, it had deteriorated, it had discolored. It no longer looked like the convincing evidence it had been in the laboratory, and the jury, faced with degraded results it could not properly evaluate, returned a verdict of not guilty. John Boddle walked free, and then, sometime after the trial, he confessed.
He had poisoned his grandfather. Marsh had been right. The signs had been correct. The court had simply lacked a way to see it clearly.
James Marsh went back to his laboratory with a particular kind of fury that I think most of us will recognize. It is the fury of a person who knows they were right and could not make anyone believe them. He spent 4 years refining a new test. He combined a sample containing arsenic with sulfuric acid and arsenic-free zinc, which produced arsine gas. He ignited the gas. As it decomposed, arsenic deposited itself in a thin, silvery black metallic film on a cold ceramic surface, visible, stable, and unmistakable. He called it the arsenic mirror. He published this method in the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal in 1836. It was so sensitive that it could detect as little as 1/50th of a milligram of arsenic, and it produced a result that would not deteriorate before a jury could see it. The Marsh test was the first reliable forensic tool for detecting arsenic in human tissue. Within 4 years of its publication, it would be used in the most famous poisoning trial of the 19th century. But before we get to that trial, I want to stop and acknowledge something that tends to get lost in the technical details of chemistry in courtrooms. James Marsh was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily practical man. He was not a university professor or a celebrated theorist. He was a working chemist at a munitions factory. He had invented a screw-time fuse for mortar shells. He was the kind of person who identified a problem. A murderer had gone free because the evidence degraded, and sat down and fixed it. No more, no less. And what he fixed, working in his laboratory out of Shea. Mere professional frustration would eventually become one of the foundational pillars of forensic science. That is how a lot of the most important things in history get built. Not by grand vision, but by someone being furious about something that went wrong. Now, 4 years after Marsh published his test, in the French town of Toul in 1840, a 24-year-old woman named Marie Lafarge stood accused of poisoning her husband, Charles. The circumstances were, to put it mildly, not great for her defense. She had purchased arsenic from a local pharmacist. Witnesses had seen her stirring white powder into her husband's food and drink. Charles Lafarge had died after weeks of worsening illness, consistent with arsenic poisoning. Local doctors applied the available chemical tests to samples taken from Charles's body. They found arsenic, or thought they did. Then a glass jar broke.
Then the results were disputed. Then the defense challenged the methods. Then the prosecution challenged the defense's challenges.
Then the court was in something approaching chaos, with experts contradicting experts and the jury having no way to evaluate what any of it meant. And so someone called for the highest authority. His name was Matthew Joseph Bonaventure Orfila, and he was, by 1840, the most famous toxicologist in the world. Born in Minorca in 1787, he had studied medicine in Valencia, Barcelona, and Paris, received his medical degree in 1811, and spent the next 3 decades constructing, almost single-handedly, the scientific discipline that now bears the name forensic toxicology. His first major work, Traité des Poisons, published in 1813 when he was just 26 years old, was a systematic catalogue of everything known about toxic substances, their chemistry, their effects on the body, their appearance at autopsy, and the methods for detecting them. It was translated into English, German, and Italian within years of publication. It established for the first time that poison detection was not a matter of intuition or experience, but of methodology. Rigorous, reproducible, verifiable methodology. By the time he was summoned to Tulle for the Lafarge trial, Orfila was the dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris. He arrived, applied the Marsh test correctly, and found arsenic in Charles Lafarge's body. He also conducted something that was genuinely innovative for its time. He tested the soil surrounding the burial site separately to confirm that the arsenic had not been absorbed into the body from the environment after death. He eliminated an alternative explanation before the defense could raise it. Marie Lafarge was convicted. But what I find more significant than the verdict is what happened in the courtroom and in the press in the weeks surrounding the trial. French newspapers covered the Marsh test in extraordinary detail. Journalists explained to their readers how arsine gas worked, what the silvery black mirror meant, what it proved about the presence of arsenic in a human body. Actual demonstrations of the Marsh test were conducted in Parisian salons, at public lectures, in amateur chemistry circles across the country, for audiences of educated people who simply wanted to understand how this remarkable tool worked. The idea that science could speak for the dead, that a human body months after burial still carried the physical evidence of what had been done to it, was genuinely new to most people. It was electrifying, and it changed something fundamental about the relationship between crime and accountability. Before the Marsh test, arsenic was the perfect pizza. Son, precisely because it was undetectable. You could pour it into someone's soup, watch them die of what looked like cholera, and walk away free. The body kept no record that science could read. The Borgers understood this. Lavausan's clients understood this. The inheritance powder was popular for exactly this reason. After the Marsh test, the calculus shifted. The body could speak. Chemistry could hear it. And the poisoner, for the first time in human history, faced a systematic scientific accountability they could not charm or bribe their way out of. Now, before the forensic history, there was an older, deeper thread running through all of this. And to find it, we need to go back much further, to a German-Swiss physician and alchemist who lived in the 16th century and whose name was magnificently Theophrastus Philippus Aureolus Bombastus von Hohenheim. He called himself Paracelsus. And in the 1530s, in the middle of the same era that was producing the Borgias and the Medicis and the slow arsenic poisoning of entire noble families, he wrote something that would eventually become one of the most important sentences in the history of medicine. Dosis sola facit venenum, the dose alone makes the poison. What Paracelsus was doing, and this is genuinely radical for his time, was arguing that there is no such thing as a poison in the absolute sense. There are only substances and doses. The substance that kills in large quantity might heal in small quantity. The substance that causes no harm at all in a tiny dose might be lethal in a large one. There is no bright line between medicine and poison. There is only the dose and the effect it produces in a particular body at a particular moment. This idea, which seems almost obvious from our modern vantage point, was not at all obvious in the 16th century. The entire tradition of poison in European courts rested on an implicit assumption that certain substances were simply deadly, and that the job of the poisoner was to get enough of them into the target's body by whatever means possible. Paracelsus was proposing something more nuanced. That toxicity was quantitative, not categorical. That the same question, how much, was the foundational question of both medicine and poison. 500 years later, every pharmaceutical drug you've ever taken was developed, tested, and approved on the basis of this principle, drug safety. Trials establish what dose produces therapeutic benefit and what dose produces harmful effects. The ratio between those two numbers, the therapeutic index as modern pharmacologists call it, is one of the primary measures of a drug's safety. The entire regulatory apparatus of modern medicine, from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States to the European Medicines Agency, rests on the foundational insight that Paracelsus articulated while standing in the middle of the very era that was producing the Medici poisoners. And there is more. Louis XIV, when he finally shut down the Chamber Ardente in 1682 and sealed the documents that implicated his mistress, did not simply walk away from the crisis. He understood that the poisoning network Lavoisier had built had thrived in part because arsenic was freely available to anyone who wanted to buy it. Pharmacists sold it for pest control. Apothecaries stocked it as a component of various remedies, and there was no systematic oversight of who purchased it or in what quantities. So he issued an edict. It made poisoning specifically a capital crime in its own right, not just a form of homicide, but its own legal category. recognizing that poison was a distinct and particular threat to public order that required distinct and particular legal treatment, and it restricted the sale of toxic substances, including arsenic, to licensed apothecaries and physicians. This was the first poison control legislation in European history, and historians have noted, with some justification, that it can be considered a direct ancestor of the regulatory frameworks that today govern the sale of pharmaceutical drugs, controlled substances, and toxic chemicals across the entire developed world. A 17th-century French king trying to protect his mistress from prosecution accidentally invented drug regulation. If that is not a perfect encapsulation of how history actually works, I genuinely do not know what is. The pattern continued into the 19th century. In 1850, a Belgian chemist named Jean Starr became the first person in history to successfully isolate a plant-based poison from human tissue. He achieved this in the case of Hippolyte Vizard de Beaucarmé, a Belgian count who had poisoned his brother-in-law with nicotine. At that point, an extremely unusual murder weapon chosen specifically because it was believed to be undetectable. Starr developed an entirely new extraction method, identified the nicotine in the victim's organs, and testified at trial. De Beaucarmé was convicted and executed. What Starr had demonstrated was that the principle applied not only to mineral poisons like arsenic, but to organic compounds derived from plants, the venoms of the natural world, the kind that plant-based alchemists had worked with for centuries. This opened a new chapter in toxicology that eventually led to the systematic understanding of alkaloids, venoms, and the entire class of biologically active compounds that now form a significant portion of our pharmaceutical pharmacopoeia: morphine, quinine, atropine, digitalis. Many of the most important medicines in history were initially understood as poisons, studied first in the context of harm, and later refined into therapeutic agents by understanding precisely how they interacted with the human body at different doses. The poison courts did not just produce toxicology as a detective science. They produced toxicology as the foundational framework for understanding how any substance, whether it is administered with murderous intent or therapeutic purpose, interacts with a living body. And I find myself sitting with a particular thought as we near the end of this story. Every time you take a headache tablet, there is a number on the package that tells you the maximum dose. That number exists because of a regulatory framework that insists a manufacturer prove their product is safe within defined dosage limits. That regulatory framework traces its intellectual lineage directly to Paracelsus' insight about dose, to Orfila's courtroom demonstrations of what chemistry could reveal in a human body, to the Marsh test and the Lafarge trial and Jean Stas, and to 100 poisoning cases that force the question: how much is too much, and how do we know? The poison culture of royal courts was grotesque and calculated and often monstrous, but it generated, as a kind of terrible byproduct, the scientific and legal infrastructure that today protects hundreds of millions of people from harm they will never know they were protected from. There is something almost too perfect about this. The very thing that powerful people use to evade accountability, the undetectability of arsenic, the mimicry of natural disease, the impossibility of proof, generated the demand for a science. That eventually made that evasion impossible. Every poisoner who went free because evidence degraded in front of a jury created pressure to build better evidence. Every unsolved death that whispered poison without being able to prove it created the hunger for a test that could speak louder than whispers. James Marsh, furious in his laboratory in Woolwich, did not set out to transform forensic science. He set out to fix the problem that had let a murderer walk free. But the fix he invented became the foundation of something much larger, because the problem was much larger than one man with arsenic-laced coffee. The problem was 2,000 years of poison as a political tool. And the solution, it turned out, was knowledge. The slow, painstaking, frustrating accumulation of knowledge about how substances behave in human bodies, how death leaves its signature in tissue and bone and hair, how the truth of what happened to someone can survive long after the person themselves is gone. Here is a question I find worth sitting with before we close this chapter. How many of the lives saved today by drug safety regulations, by forensic toxicology, by the entire infrastructure of chemical testing hat stands between you and an untested substance? How many of those lives would have been lost without the specific pressure that the poison courts of history created? Without Lavoisier and the affair of the poisons, would Louis XIV have needed to regulate arsenic? Without the arsenic murder cases of the Victorian era, would James Marsh have had any reason to build his apparatus? Without the Lafarge trial and its chaos of competing experts and degraded evidence and broken test tubes, Would Orfila have had a stage on which to demonstrate what rigorous forensic chemistry could achieve? The horrifying thing about this is not that good came out of evil, because we are generally comfortable with that narrative. The horrifying thing is that the specific good that emerged was so precisely shaped by the specific evil. The poison courts did not accidentally produce some general improvement in human welfare. They produced, through 2,000 years of murder and concealment and the relentless pressure of the question, how do you prove it? Exactly the science that was needed to counter the precise threat they represented, which leads us finally to the place where all of this brings us. We have W spent the length of this video inside the most extraordinary world of calculated harm in human history. We have seen what poison meant to people who wielded power, not merely as a weapon, but as a language, a form of politics, a way of writing history without leaving a signature. We have seen what it cost, the people who died, and the people who survived, and the people who were simply caught in the wrong household at the wrong moment with the wrong wallpaper. And we have seen what came out the other side. The question that remains is the simplest one of all. What does it mean for us? What do the poison courts of history tell us about the world we live in now? About power and accountability and the permanent human desire to act without consequence. That is the place we are going in this final section. And what I want to explore there is something that I think most stories about historical poison miss entirely, which is that the most important legacy of all of this was not chemical, it was not forensic, it was not even legal. It was a question, a single, persistent, uncomfortable question that the history of poison forced into public consciousness and never quite allowed to leave. Who is accountable, and how do we prove it? That question, who is accountable, and how do we prove it, is not just a philosophical problem, it is a very practical one. And to understand what has actually changed since the Borgias and the Medicis and Lavoisian and Sixi, I want to take you to London, November of 2006. A man named Alexander Litvinenko sat down for tea. He was 43 years old. He was a former lieutenant colonel of the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB, who had fled to London in the year 2000 and been granted asylum in Britain. He had spent 6 years writing books and giving interviews and working as a consultant for British intelligence, methodically detailing what he insisted was the deep corruption at the heart of the Russian state. He had accused Putin personally of ordering the murder of a journalist. He had accused the FSB of staging terror attacks and blaming them on Chechen rebels. He was not a popular figure in Moscow. On the 1st of November 2006, he met 2 men in the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel on Grosvenor Square. One was Andrei Lugovoy. The other was Dmitry Koftan. Both were former Russian intelligence operatives.
The meeting lasted perhaps an hour. Litvinenko drank his tea. He left. And within hours he was violently ill.
Nausea, stomach pain, the beginning of a collapse that his doctors initially attributed to some form of food poisoning. Over the following 3 weeks, his condition deteriorated in ways that baffled the physicians treating him. His hair began to fall out in clumps. His bone marrow stopped producing blood cells. He became unrecognizable. The photographs taken in his hospital bed in the final days of his life show a skeletal, hairless man who looks decades older than the one who had walked into that hotel bar. 3 weeks after drinking his tea, on the 23rd of November, 2006, Alexander Litvinenko died. It took until after his death for British nuclear scientists to identify the cause. It was not a conventional poison. It was polonium-210, a radioactive isotope that emits alpha radiation, which cannot penetrate a sheet of paper or a layer of skin, and therefore cannot be detected by standard radiation monitors. You could carry a lethal quantity through airport security without triggering a single alarm. But once inside the body, ingested or inhaled, alpha radiation destroys DNA at close range with a ferocity that makes most conventional poisons look gentle by comparison. 1 microgram of polonium-210, 1/1,000,000th of a gram, a quantity invisible to the naked eye, is enough to kill an adult. Litvinenko had ingested approximately 10 micrograms, 200 times the lethal dose. Here is the critical detail. Polonium-210 cannot be produced in a kitchen laboratory. It cannot be ordered online. It cannot be obtained from a pharmacist or synthesized by an amateur chemist. It is produced inside nuclear reactors by a process that requires enormous industrial infrastructure. The only country that routinely produces it at scale is Russia. The polonium in Litvinenko's green tea had a specific radiological signature that British nuclear scientists were able to trace not just to the substance's general type, but to its specific isotope, but to its probable place of manufacture in a Russian reactor. The killer had left a trail that was invisible to human senses, undetectable to airport security, impervious to conventional forensics, and yet perfectly legible to 21st-century nuclear science. The British investigation that followed traced the polonium trail across more than 40 locations in London and yonder. It was in the hotel room where Lugovoy and Kovton had stayed. It was on the chairs they had sat in. It was in the restaurant where they had eaten. It was on the commercial aircraft they had flown in on from Moscow, and on the aircraft they flew back on after the meeting. Everywhere the men had gone, they had left an invisible radioactive signature that modern science could read as clearly as if they had written their names in every room. A British public inquiry concluded in 2016 that the murder was almost certainly carried out by Lugovoy and Kovton acting on behalf of the FSB, and that the operation was most likely approved by President Putin personally. The European Court of Human Rights, ruling in 2021, found that Russia bore state responsibility for the assassination. Lugovoy is currently a member of the Russian parliament. He has never been extradited, never been tried, and has called the charges against him absurd. This is where we come to the strange, uncomfortable truth that the entire history of poison in royal courts has been building toward. Knowledge has advanced. Science has advanced.
The capacity to detect poison, to trace it to its source, to construct a forensic.
Sick record that no amount of official denial can erase. All of that has advanced beyond anything that James Marsh in his Woolwich laboratory in 1836 could have imagined, beyond anything that Matthew Orfila standing before a jury in Tull in 1840 was pointing toward. And yet, on the 4th of March 2018, just over 11 years after Litvinenko's death, Sergei Skripal, a 66-year-old former Russian military intelligence officer who'd been exchanged in a spy swap and was living quietly in the English city of Salisbury, was found unconscious on a public bench with his daughter, Yulia, beside him. Police and paramedics initially thought they might have been overcome by drugs. What they had actually encountered was Novichok, a military-grade nerve agent developed by the Soviet Union during a classified program called Foliant in the 1970s and 80s. Novichok inhibits the enzyme that allows nerve signals to stop firing, causing the body's muscles to contract continuously until the victim dies. The Novichok had been applied to the door handle at Skripal's house. Investigators believe it was smeared there by two GRU officers using the names Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bosharov, names later identified. D as aliases for Anatoly Chapiga and Alexander Miskin. Both the Skripals survived after weeks of critical care. A police officer who had attended the scene also fell ill and recovered. 4 months later, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis was at home in Amesbury, about 11 kilometers from Salisbury. Her partner, Charlie Raleigh, had found what appeared to be a small bottle of Nina Rixai perfume somewhere in Salisbury. He gave it to Dawn as a gift. She sprayed it on her wrists. Within 15 minutes, she was collapsing. She died on the 8th of July, 2018. The bottle her partner had found was not a perfume bottle. It was the container the Russian agents had used to smuggle the Novichok into Britain. They had discarded it somewhere in Salisbury after the attack. The inquiry that examined her death concluded it had contained enough nerve agent to kill thousands of people. On the 4th of December 2025, 7 years after Dawn Sturgis died, Lord Hughes of Omersley published the report of the public inquiry into her death. He concluded that the assassination attempt on Sergei Skripal had been authorized at the highest level. His words were precise and deliberate. The attack, he wrote, must. I have been authorized by President Putin. The Kremlin denied it, as they have denied everything. The two men identified as the main suspects appeared on Russian state television after their names were made public. They said they had been tourists visiting Salisbury Cathedral. They seemed to be enjoying themselves. Now, I want to be very direct about what this means, because I think there is a temptation, when telling stories about poison and power and history, to end with a satisfying arc. Science advances. Detection improves. The poisoners are caught. Justice was done. The story closed. That is not quite the story. What has genuinely changed since the Borgias poured Cantarella into their guests' wine in the 1490s is this. The trail is now almost always visible. The polonium that killed Litvinenko was found in 40 locations across London. On the aircraft his killers flew in on and flew back on, in their hotel rooms and at the restaurant tables they ate at. The Novichok in Salisbury was identified within days by the scientists at Porton Down. 10,000 hours of closed-circuit television footage documented the movements of the Skripal suspects through Britain. Their real identities were uncovered, not by intelligence agencies, but by investigative journalists using publicly available records, working openly, within months of the attack. The cover-up is harder now, not impossible, but harder. The science that Matthew Orfila and James Marsh and their successors built, brick by patient brick over 2 centuries, has made the world more legible in ways that people who poison for political purposes find increasingly inconvenient. What has not changed is the calculation that some actors still make, that the power to act is worth more than the ability to conceal. The inquiry into Dawn Sturgis's death noted something that I find genuinely clarifying about how state poison works in the 21st century. It observed that the attack on Sergei Skripal was not designed simply as revenge. It was designed as a public statement, intended, in the inquiry's own words, to stand as a vivid demonstration of Russian power calculated for both international and domestic consumption. Read that carefully. The poison was not meant to be undetectable. The attack was meant to be attributable. The message being sent was precisely, "We did this. We can do this anywhere, and there is nothing you can do about it." The denial afterward was not a sincere claim of innocence. It was performance. It was another layer of the demonstration. Look at what we can do, and then look at us deny it with a straight face, while a man sits in Parliament. This is a version of the logic that Louis XIV's court operated on. The logic of the sealed chest. The logic that said, the magnitude of our power is itself our protection. La Rainey put it perfectly 340 years ago, and the words have lost none of their accuracy.
The enormity of their crimes proved their safeguard.
The chemistry has changed, the safeguard has not. And yet, and I want to hold both of these things at once, because I think they are both true, the world has also genuinely changed in ways that matter. The Chemical Weapons Convention, signed in 1993 and ratified by 193 nations, prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. In November 2019, months after the Salisbury attack, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons added Novichok to its list of banned substances. Not retroactively prosecuted, not punished, but named, defined, prohibited, and placed under the oversight of an international body that can investigate its use. That body exists, and that prohibition exists because of Salisbury, because the forensic evidence was overwhelming and public and irrefutable enough to force a legal response, even when a political one was blocked. Is it enough? Number. But it is something that did not exist before, and that now exists in the world because of exactly the pressure that 2,000 years of poison history created. The pressure of the question. How do we prove it?
And what happens when we... This is what I want to leave you with.
The history of poison in royal courts is not at its heart a history of evil.
That is too simple and too comfortable. It is a history of the gap between power and accountability, the gap that exists in every era between what the powerful can do and what the rest of the world can prove and what it can therefore demand. That gap has been closing in fits and starts and reversals for about 2 centuries. It is not closed. It will probably never be fully closed. There will always be new poisons, new delivery mechanisms, new ways of acting without visible consequence that outpace the science designed to detect them. The technological arms race bet. Ween the poisoner and the forensic scientist is as ongoing as the one between the padlock and the lockpick. But here is what is also true. Cixi poisoned an emperor and falsified his medical records, and for 100 years no one could prove it. Then, a team of researchers analyzed his hair in 2008, found arsenic 2,400 times the normal level, concentrated at the roots, the weeks just before death, and published their findings in a report that is now part of the permanent historical record of the Qing dynasty. Litvinenko was killed with a substance designed to be invisible, and the trail it left was traced to a nuclear reactor in Russia and placed before international courts. Dawn Sturgis died from a nerve agent discarded on a public street, and 7 years later, a public inquiry with Lord Hughes at its head placed moral responsibility for her death at the door of a sitting head of state in a published report that will be read for centuries. The powerful still act. They still sometimes get away with it, in the immediate term. But the record accumulates. The science advances. The questions get answered even when the answers arrive too late for justice and too early for comfort.
That accumulation, that slow, patient, infuriatingly incomplete, but genuinely real accumulation of knowledge against impunity, is perhaps the most important thing that the entire history of poison, from the Roman Pregustator to the OPCW laboratory in The Hague, has produced. The poison courts left us forensic science. They left us toxicology. They left us drug regulation and chemical weapons conventions and international courts that can, even if imperfectly, name what happened and who was responsible. They left us a world that is harder to poison in secret than any world that came before it. That is the legacy of every hidden vial, every falsified autopsy, every sealed chest, every locked box marked to be opened in the event of my death. They were trying to hide the truth, and in doing so, they created the machinery that finds it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. This has been a long journey through the banquet halls of Rome and the perfumed corridors of Versailles, through the forbidden city in the grey November rain, and the locked laboratory of a woman who brought food to the sick and poisoned them, through alchemists who burned their emperors alive with elixirs of immortality, and the forensic scientists who eventually learned to read what a strand of hair, a century old, still had to say. If there is one thread that runs through all of it, through every case, every court, every empire, it is this. Power tries to act without leaving a mark, and history slowly, stubbornly, sometimes with the delay of decades or centuries, finds the mark anyway. That is a story worth telling, and I am grateful you listened.
The next story is already waiting for us.
It lives in a different world, a different century, a different kind of court, a different shape of human ambition trying to outrun accountability. But the questions it asks will feel, I suspect, very familiar. Stay close. I will see you there. Good night. Sweet dreams.